Life often hangs by a thread, especially when it comes to the struggle for survival. The main character of this story twice found himself on the brink of death, but miraculously managed to avoid a fatal end. Unfortunately, his loved ones were destined for a different fate. The story begins with Rolf, who was born in Germany. At the age of 11, he emigrated to the United States with his mother. The woman, seeking to leave behind an unsuccessful marriage, quickly remarried, hoping for a new beginning. Rolf grew up to be a balanced young man, demonstrating good academic performance. After entering college, he met Kate, a girl who was studying the same major. Their life views turned out to be surprisingly similar. Kate, like Rolf, had a calm demeanor and sociable character. She dreamed of her own American dream, creating a family with a like-minded person. Rolf immediately impressed her as a suitable partner. The young people found so much in common that after their first meeting, they became an integral part of each other's lives. At that time, Rolf was just over 20. Both had serious intentions for the future, and their parents supported these aspirations. Everything was going as well as it could be. The couple decided to change their place of residence and set off on a journey across the country. At first, they lived in Nevada, then moved to Utah. But this was just the beginning of their travels. They visited many corners of the USA. For a while, Rolf and Kay just dated, but eventually decided to formalize their relationship. Almost immediately after the wedding, they began planning another move. This time their goal was a more spacious house where they could raise children. The year 1963 brought the young couple to a small town called Humble in Texas, with a population of barely 10,000. Both were educated, loving people, active members of the Christian community. They adored children and dreamed of a large family. The couple quickly integrated into the local community, earning the respect of their neighbors. However, their happiness was overshadowed by the inability to have their own children. For a long time, they tried to overcome this problem, but to no avail. Eventually, the couple decided to turn to adoption. This is how Lena appeared in their home, and 3 years later, a boy named Sean. Unexpectedly for everyone, shortly after adopting the second child, Kay found out she was pregnant. The couple perceived this as a real miracle. The pregnancy went so smoothly that Kay didn't even notice it at first. Soon their biological daughter was born, whom they named Trisha. The family's life seemed perfect. They had everything necessary for a happy existence and enjoyed every day. Rolf showed a talent for trade even in his student years and dreamed of his own business. By the time the children were born, he already had a stable income, which allowed Kay to focus on household duties. Thanks to entrepreneurship and hard work, in 1969 Rolf founded a company that quickly became part of Houston's trade network. The family's financial situation allowed them to buy another small house in Oakley, Utah. In the 1990s, Oakley's population barely exceeded 500 people. The mountainous area created an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility. Local residents knew each other well, and the Tiede family harmoniously blended into this close-knit circle. Several times a year, the whole family came here to escape from the city bustle. The choice of location was not accidental. Firstly, it was extremely picturesque, with the house located high in the mountains. Secondly, this place was considered very safe, much calmer than any surrounding settlements. The seclusion was also attractive. It was about 4 kilometers to the nearest road. A scenic river flowed nearby, surrounded by trees on both banks. Despite the difficulties with transport, even in winter the family spent their Christmas holidays here. This tradition was strictly observed every year. To get to the house, they had to leave the car in the parking lot by the road and switch to snowmobiles. This was the only way to climb so high into the mountains without spending the whole day on the road. October 1990, the couple's habits remained unchanged. They again decided to spend the Christmas holidays in their remote forest retreat, as well as meet with Kay's family, who lived nearby. On December 20th, Kay and her son Sean flew from Texas to Oakley, where they were met by Kay's sister, Claudia. She picked them up in her car so they could all wait for the rest of the family together. Rolf, Lena, and Trisha were to arrive the next day, on the evening of December 21. Traditionally, Rolf finished work matters before the vacation, while Kay went to her sister Claudia to organize the meeting and prepare, stocking up on necessary products and things before the trip to the mountains. The usual place where they usually left their cars and switched to snowmobiles, Kay and Claudia noticed a suspicious young man. Despite the severe frost, he was wearing light shoes and a thin shirt, which looked strange. Kay called out to him and offered help, but the man did not react, only quickened his pace and disappeared. Despite the unusualness of this encounter, Kay decided not to cloud the family vacation with anxious thoughts. They reached the house closer to sunset, had dinner, and, tired from the journey, decided to stay the night. In the morning, Claudia told Kay that she had heard some sounds outside the house at night. She was sure she had seen a human silhouette through the window. The women tried to find traces around the house, but to no avail. It seemed that the unknown person had used their paths to remain unnoticed. In the end, they decided to focus on preparing for the weekend, as there was a busy day ahead. By the time Rolf arrived with his daughters, everything was ready. On December 21st, the head of the family with 20-year-old Lena and 16-year-old Tricia arrived at the car park, from where they planned to get to the house. Here they were met by Kay, who told them about the events of the past days, mentioning the suspicious people she and her sister had encountered. She was particularly worried about that strange young man, whose image wouldn't leave her mind. He seemed suspicious, not like a local resident, even dangerous. Concerned, Kay asked Rolf to go to her relatives and get hunting rifles. She wanted him to deliver them by snowmobile to the house in case of unforeseen situations. However, Rolf refused, saying that there was no need for this and that everything would be fine. Rolf always avoided weapons, considering them too dangerous for domestic use. He had no practical experience with firearms, be it pistols or rifles. The man argued his position by saying that their location was one of the safest in the region. Over the last century, only one serious incident had occurred in the vicinity, and that was related not to violence, but to aggressive behavior on the road. After this incident, only a few minor thefts were recorded over several decades. Unfortunately, the head of the family did not realize what dangerous individuals were now in the vicinity. Kay, on the contrary, felt anxious after meeting the suspicious young man. Her intuition suggested that they should be careful. Therefore, despite her husband's objections, she independently took several rifles and placed them on her snowmobile, explaining that this would make her feel more confident. Rolf did not argue with his wife. Adult family members, along with the teenagers, transported all the necessary things to the house. Claudia, Kay's sister, had left for the city in the morning, intending to return with additional purchases for the celebration. She remembered that she had forgotten to buy some important products for the upcoming festivities. The Tiede family decorated the house and completed preparations for the holiday. However, they also realized they had forgotten to buy something, so they decided to make another trip to the city. Sean, tired of all this fuss, asked permission to stay overnight at Aunt Claudia's. His request was granted, which, as it turned out later, saved the boy's life. The couple with their daughters went to visit Kay's mother, Beth Potts. At that time, Beth was 72 years old, had vision problems and was partially paralyzed due to a car accident that occurred in 1983. The Tiede family regularly visited her and then took her with them to the mountain house. This time everything happened according to the usual scenario. The whole evening the family spent in warm communication, planning to go to the mountains the next day. On December 22nd, around noon, the Tiede family again set out for the city. The day turned out to be particularly frosty. After this, they split up. Rolf and Tricia planned to return to the house later, while Kay, Lena, and Beth headed to the mountains immediately. A time gap of about 2 hours formed between the two groups. Kay and Lena, arriving first, began to prepare everything necessary for dinner. When Lena stopped by the garage, she noticed a dark silhouette in the main bedroom. At first, the girl thought it was her cousin David, who was supposed to visit in the coming days, so she didn't pay much attention to it. Entering the kitchen, Lena turned on the hot water to warm her frozen hands. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a dark figure hiding behind the refrigerator. The girl assumed that it was David trying to scare her, and smiled to herself. But when the stranger came into the light, Lena realized her mistake with horror. Before her stood a young man with curly hair, who aimed a pistol directly at her head. Lena tried to warn the others, but it was too late. They had also seen the armed attacker. Kay probably regretted not taking the rifle from the garage, as she was now helpless in front of the armed criminal. The criminal ordered Lena to help her grandmother and mother go upstairs. The sick Beth, along with her daughter and granddaughter, struggled up the stairs, fearing that the slightest delay could provoke shooting. On the second floor, another attacker appeared, wearing glasses and also armed with a pistol. Kay begged them not to harm them, promising to give everything they had. In response, the curly-haired man shot her without hesitation. The woman fell to the floor with a cry of pain, after which the attacker fired several more bullets into her, then he aimed the weapon at Beth and shot her in the face without a word. However, the elderly woman did not die immediately. She fell, but immediately tried to get up. The ringleader shot her several more times. He seemed surprised by the number of bullets spent, but clearly enjoyed the situation. Lena, who was sure it was her turn, said goodbye to life. However, a different fate awaited her. The attackers dragged the girl into the bedroom, gagged her mouth with a dirty sock, and tied her hands and feet. The shooter's accomplice brought a dog and gave it to Lena, saying it should calm her down. After this, the criminals left the room, returning to their victims. The gang leader shot Kay and Beth once more. Then they searched the bodies, taking all the jewelry and valuable items from their pockets. The criminals dragged the bodies outside and sprinkled them with snow on the terrace to keep them out of sight. This time, Lena was desperately trying to free herself from her bonds. She had just witnessed the murder of her grandmother and mother and understood that her father and younger sister would soon return. The girl realized that she herself was in mortal danger. She wanted to somehow warn her relatives, but didn't have time. Rolf and Tricia drove up to the house on snowmobiles. Sean, as mentioned earlier, had stayed with Kay's relatives, hoping to join the family later. This decision saved the boy's life. The killers, staying close to Lena, were already waiting for new victims. One of them put a gun to the girl's temple, threatening to kill her if she made a sound. When Rolf entered the house, the criminals led Lena out in front of them, using her as a human shield. Together with his accomplice, they met Rolf and Tricia in the living room. The newcomers immediately noticed the bodies of their loved ones and rushed to them, but the criminals stopped them. Rolf, trying to save the situation, began to take everything out of his pockets, giving the criminals cash and his expensive watch. However, these attempts proved futile. The leader ordered his accomplice to shoot Rolf. The second attacker, obviously hesitating, did not want to take responsibility for the murder. He stood indecisively for 30 seconds, which seemed like an eternity to those present. Finally, losing patience, the leader snatched the gun from his accomplice and pressed the trigger himself. However, the weapon just clicked, not firing. He tried again to no avail. On the third attempt, the weapon worked. The bullet hit Rolf in the face, causing a severe injury. Tricia, witnessing this horrible scene, fell into hysterics, while her father sank to the floor, bleeding. The criminals, without wasting time, searched the pockets of the wounded man, but did not touch the girl. Instead of continuing the bloodshed, the attackers took Lena and Tricia to the bedroom, where they locked them up. Then they took a canister of gasoline, which was stored in the house for refueling snowmobiles, and began methodically pouring the flammable liquid all around. It turned out that the criminals, waiting for the arrival of the house inhabitants, had left many traces of their presence, as they had been entertaining themselves all this time. The bandits were not ashamed of their actions. They unwrapped all the Christmas presents of the Tiede family, filming the process on a video camera found in the house. They even did not shy away from the holiday food prepared by Kay, and had fun as if at a party. Obviously, the destruction of evidence by arson was planned in advance, so they behaved so casually. In the garage, the criminals found several more canisters of gasoline and decided to use all the fuel. Having doused the premises with the flammable substance, they returned to the wounded Rolf. The leader coldly shot him in the back of the head, then doused the body with gasoline. The next step was loading the loot onto the snowmobiles. The criminals ordered the girls to do this work. The vehicles were in the garage, which they deliberately did not douse with gasoline, planning to use them for escape. At this moment, one of the criminals, Taylor, reloaded his gun, unbuttoned his jacket, and demonstrated a knife. Noticing Lena's reaction, he ominously commented, "Don't worry, I'm as skilled with a knife as I am with a gun." These words caused incredible fear in the girl. After setting fire to the house, the attackers set off, taking the two hostages with them. Paradoxically, they forced the girls themselves to operate the snowmobiles. During the ride, Lena and Tricia tried to come up with a rescue plan, considering the possibility of a deliberate accident or collision with a tree to get rid of the kidnappers. However, they couldn't develop any real plan. This time, not far from the scene of the tragedy, the girl's uncle, Randy, was driving by in his car. He noticed two snowmobiles with the criminals and, not suspecting the real situation, waved his hand friendlily. Randy assumed these were acquaintances of his niece's, possibly their boyfriends, but was surprised by the cold reaction to his greeting. Usually, Lena and Tricia were very polite and always greeted him. The criminals, not recognizing the man, simply drove past. Confused, Randy decided to follow them. In the parking lot, the bandits transferred the girls to the Tiede family car. They hastily unloaded the loot from the snowmobiles, calmly discussing the escape plan. The hostages realized that the criminals intended to reach New York. Horrified by the realization that their chances of survival were minimal, Lena silently prayed that if their death was inevitable, it would not be torturous. In this hopeless situation, the girls were forced to obey and sit in the back seat of the car. Uncle Randy appeared again in the parking lot, still waving. Lena and Tricia deliberately ignored his greeting, not wanting him to become the next victim. The gang leader noticed the man who was actively gesticulating. Grabbing his gun, he asked Lena if she knew this person. The girl lied, saying she had no idea who it was. A moment later, the car with the hostages drove away. Soon after the criminals' departure, a man approached Randy in the parking lot. Despite the severe frost, he was without outerwear, shoes, and even a helmet. His face looked terrible, it seemed to be literally torn apart, with frozen drops of blood and severe swelling. Randy recognized his relative with horror. It was Rolf. Barely standing on his feet, Rolf told an incredible story about how his family was shot in the house, how he himself was shot twice in the head. He miraculously survived this attack and managed to get to the parking lot, seeking to save his daughters. According to Rolf, the house in the forest was already ablaze, and he barely managed to escape alive. The man described in detail how the criminals set fire to the house, how he himself was doused with gasoline, but managed to pretend to be dead and wait until the noise of the snowmobile subsided. At first, Rolf tried to fight the fire, but due to the large amount of fuel, the flames quickly spread. His jacket caught fire right on him, but he managed to run to the bathroom and take it off, receiving only minor burns. Rolf was lucky that the garage remained undamaged, and there was still one snowmobile inside. Having lost half of his family, he, despite severe injuries, desperately set off in pursuit of the kidnappers of his daughters. Under the influence of adrenaline, overcoming unbearable pain, he traveled 4 kilometers. Although Rolf could barely see, he knew the road well and managed to reach the parking. It was obvious that the man urgently needed medical help. Randy put him in his car and drove towards the city. However, the nearest medical center was too far away, and Randy feared he might not be able to save Rolf's life in time. He immediately called the rescue service, reporting the need for a helicopter to evacuate the wounded man, as well as informing them about the fire in the forest house. Meanwhile, the criminals with the hostages were moving towards the canyon. Suddenly, a patrol car raced past them. In a moment, the police car turned around and began pursuit. The criminals ignored the law enforcement officers' demands to stop. A dangerous high-speed chase began. The kidnappers' car sometimes accelerated to 150 km per hour. Given the adverse weather conditions and slippery road, the situation was extremely risky. In an attempt to avoid pursuit, the criminals even drove through a police roadblock. The pursuit of the criminals was intensifying. Several more police cars joined the initial patrol vehicle. The chase lasted about half an hour and ended in the criminals' car got stuck on an embankment. The bandits desperately tried to overcome the obstacle, seeking to reach the forest where they hoped to hide in an off-road vehicle. This moment became crucial for the hostages. Taking advantage of the criminals' confusion, Lena and Tricia, holding hands tightly, jumped out of the car. Noticing the police, the girls rushed to them, seeking salvation. Law enforcement officers reacted instantly, aiming their weapons at the criminals. About a dozen pistols were pointed at the driver and his accomplice. As soon as the hostages were safe, a short but intense shootout began. Lena, overwhelmed with emotions and a thirst for revenge, begged the police to shoot the attackers who had taken the lives of her mother and grandmother. However, the criminals quickly surrendered as soon as their car received several hits. As a result, both perpetrators were detained without any physical injuries. Parallel to these events, another drama was unfolding. The medical team on the helicopter promptly arrived at the location where the wounded Rolf was. Doctors began a desperate struggle for the man's life. Despite severe injuries, shots to the face and back of the head, Rolf miraculously remained alive and even maintained consciousness for almost the entire time. Later, he not only survived but also recovered, avoiding serious long-term consequences of the injuries received. Meanwhile, firefighters were waging a fierce battle against the fire in the forest house. Their efforts were successful, they managed to extinguish the fire, and the building did not burn down completely. When the police arrived at the crime scene, they were shocked by what they saw. According to them, it was the most horrific sight in their entire professional career. There were traces of blood and bullet holes everywhere. Although the house survived, its interior suffered severe damage. The bodies of the victims remained inside, and the air was filled with an unbearable smell of burnt flesh. Among the ruins, investigators found a video camera that the criminals had used for entertainment. The recordings showed them filming each other, capturing their victims, and mocking them. Particularly cynical was how the bandits unwrapped the Tiede family's Christmas presents, accompanying this with jokes. These frames demonstrated the criminals' shocking indifference to human life and suffering. The detainees turned out to be 25-year-old Vaughn Taylor and 21-year-old Edward Delly. Taylor, the man with curly hair, was identified as the main organizer of the crime. Both had criminal backgrounds and had been serving sentences in Utah State Prison before this incident. Taylor had been convicted of burglary and arson, while his accomplice had less serious charges. Fate brought them together in a rehabilitation center, where they were sent shortly before the end of their prison terms. The purpose of this facility was to prepare former inmates for normal life in society, without returning to criminal activities. However, instead of rehabilitation, these two developed a cruel plan for new crimes. Having escaped from the rehabilitation center, they did not embark on the path of correction, as envisaged by the rehabilitation program. Instead, on December 14, they headed to Oakley, where Taylor's father had a house. For a week, they engaged in robberies and break-ins in the area. It was Vaughn Taylor who was the suspicious man without outerwear that Kay noticed in the parking lot on the day of their arrival. At that moment, he was surveying the nearest houses, looking for potential targets for robbery. The appearance of the Tiede family immediately caught his attention. On December 22, when the family went to the city, the criminals broke into their house. They missed the owners by only half an hour. Once inside, the bandits behaved as if they were at home, drinking, eating, and entertaining themselves while waiting for the victims to return. After committing the murders and robbery, Taylor proposed an escape plan, deciding to use the Tiede family car. They decided to use the girls as human shields, intending to reach New York, where they planned to get rid of the hostages and disappear in the bustle of the big city. On January 22, the criminals were officially charged. The list of charges was long and serious: 2 first-degree murders, attempted first-degree murder, 2 aggravated kidnappings. In addition, they were charged with theft, arson, resisting arrest, and escaping from a correctional facility. Initially, both suspects tried to avoid responsibility by claiming insanity. However, the examination did not reveal any mental disorders that could affect their ability to be responsible for their actions. It became obvious that this was just an attempt to delay the process. 5 months later, Taylor changed tactics and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for this confession, all other charges against him were dropped. This move seemed strange, given that under state laws, the crimes he committed were punishable by death penalty in any case that in court. Taylor confessed to being the organizer of the entire crime and personally shooting 2 women. He showed no signs of remorse for his actions. The forensic expert confirmed the brutality of the crime, finding 5 gunshot wounds in Kay's body and 3 in Beth's. Rolf also suffered severe injuries. He was shot twice in the head and face, then doused with gasoline and set on fire. The moment when Rolf, who had survived, entered the courtroom, was a shock for Taylor. The defendant could not hide his surprise, even swore, not believing his eyes. He could not comprehend how Rolf could have survived such a brutal attack. Eventually, the court sentenced Taylor to death. Unlike his accomplice, Edward Delly did not plead guilty and decided to face a jury trial. His process began 2 weeks after Taylor's sentencing. Like the main defendant, Delly did not know that Rolf had survived. However, from the very beginning, he showed remorse and insisted on his non-involvement in the murders. According to him, the initial plan involved only robbery. Delly claimed that he did not expect Taylor to start killing, and categorically refused to shoot anyone. During Edward Delly's trial, the prosecution persistently tried to portray him as the same ruthless criminal as Taylor. However, Delly stood firm, insisting that he could not pull the trigger. In this situation, Rolf's testimony, who was a direct eyewitness to the events, could be crucial for the defendant's fate, potentially saving him from a lethal injection. Delly's lawyer made every effort to create a more positive image of his client. He persistently convinced the jury that Edward had become a victim of circumstances, accidentally falling under the influence of bad company while serving his previous sentence. The defense had several strong arguments, including testimonies from those who survived the attack. Lena, for example, remembered how Edward brought her a dog, trying to calm her down. Moreover, during the escape attempt in the stolen car, he constantly communicated with the girls, seeking to reduce their fear. It was Edward who advised the hostages to leave the car when it finally stopped. The jury spent several hours in tense debates before reaching a verdict. Eventually, they found Edward guilty of second-degree murder. This decision meant life imprisonment for him, but allowed him to avoid the death penalty. After the completion of the criminal trials, the Tiede family initiated a lawsuit against the state, demanding compensation for the deaths of Kay and Beth. The survivors believed that the state leadership was responsible for the escape of the inmates from the rehabilitation center, which led to the tragedy. Their claims had solid grounds. Turned out that on December 22, Vaughn Taylor contacted his acquaintance Scott Manley, informing him about the escape from the rehabilitation center and the theft of weapons. Taylor also confessed that by that time, the criminals had already robbed several houses in Oakley and were now planning an attack on an entire family. Their plan included kidnapping 2 girls, whom they intended to use as human shields during their escape to New York. Frightened, Scott immediately turned to law enforcement agencies, detailing Taylor's confessions. However, despite the seriousness of the information and even having data on the probable location of the criminals, the police ignored this message. Unfortunately, the court rejected the Tiede family's claim, and no one was held accountable for this fatal negligence. In 2001, Lena received an unexpected letter from Edward Delly, in which he asked for forgiveness. He wrote that life behind bars had changed his worldview. He admitted that he had previously been a reckless young man who had fallen under the influence of a cool friend. Lena read this letter over and over again, unable to hold back tears. Only after a decade did she find the strength to respond, writing that she forgave Edward. This act of forgiveness brought her long-awaited relief. Edward Delly did not try to appeal the court's decision. Considering the severity of the crime in which he participated, the chances of his release are practically non-existent. However, this cannot be said about the gang leader, Vaughn Taylor, who filed 4 appeals, all of which were rejected. He cited various reasons, including bias of the jury, all of whom, in his opinion, were too religious. Despite the obvious groundlessness of these appeals, Taylor continued to use legal maneuvers to postpone the execution of his death sentence. Rolf, despite severe injuries, fully recovered. After the tragedy, he married 3 times. After repairing the house after the fire, the family continued to spend time there, preserving the memory of their lost loved ones. Lena and Tricia started their own families, becoming mothers of several children. In 2008, Rolf passed away due to cancer, surrounded by the love of his family. Not everything is always as it seems at first glance, and people are no exception. Take a closer look at those around you. You may notice that one of your acquaintances or neighbors is behaving unusually. Their actions might appear to be innocent jokes or idle chatter, but sometimes there is more to it than that. This is a story about a transformation that society realized too late. It is reminiscent of the prose of life, where trust and kindness can sometimes turn into betrayal and fear. Theodore Shaughnessy, the youngest of 3 children in the family, was born on February 7, 1963. His relatives, who lived in Arizona near Phoenix, called him Ted. From a very young age, all the children in the family were fascinated by speed, so it's no surprise that Ted grew up with a love for fast cars and everything related to them. The boy dreamed of sports cars since childhood. Friends and relatives described him as a brave and fearless young man for whom adrenaline was the best medicine. Despite this, Ted was a kind, cheerful person and a good friend, son, and brother. In the early 1980s, at a video arcade in Phoenix, Ted met Corey Harmon. The young people quickly found common ground and began dating, marrying at the end of the decade. The couple moved to Austin, Texas, where they started their own jewelry business. It was a high-level joint venture in which each of them invested a part of themselves. Corey was in love with precious stones and fine art, so in the family company, she worked as an appraiser. And Ted became the face of their store. He had an incredible knack for communication, knew how to attract people's attention, and quickly found common ground with them. Wherever Ted appeared, he immediately became the life of the party. This greatly helped in business. The man easily negotiated with customers and partners, achieving favorable terms and leaving everyone satisfied. Ted and Corey perfectly complemented each other, forming a well-coordinated tandem. Their fortune was estimated at $8 million. According to those close to them, Theodore was generous and often bought groceries for those in need. The family business continued to grow, so the couple purchased a beautiful new home near their store. By 2000, the successful family had brought to life the true American dream, however with one peculiarity: they had 2 Rottweiler dogs. In a sense, they replaced children for the couple, because despite their great desire to become parents, they could not conceive a baby. But in the spring of 2000, Ted and Corey flew to Ukraine, where they adopted an 18-month-old boy they named Nicholas. This event became the long-awaited motherhood and fatherhood for the Shaughnessy family. It seemed that now they had everything necessary for happiness. Years passed, and Nick grew up. Like his father, he loved fast cars and the feeling of speed. To experience these emotions, the father and son often went go-karting, and Ted also took the child for rides in sports cars. The boy began to show business acumen. Back in middle school, he sold chocolate bars right out of his school locker, always having pocket money. In high school, Nick became passionate about working on cars. His parents helped him financially to start this business. The young man purchased the necessary equipment and involved his friends in the work. At one point, he already had 4 people working for him. Around the same time, in 2015, Nick met a girl named Jacqueline Edison, whom everyone called Jackie. She had just moved from New York to Texas. Immediately after their first meeting, the young couple felt a mutual attraction, but the girl did not appeal to Nicholas' mother and father. Corey intuitively felt that Jackie was not right for her son. However, no one stood in the way of the teenagers' relationship so as not to lose touch with Nick. After graduating from high school, the young lovebirds moved into a townhouse near the town of College Station. There, Jackie planned to study engineering while her boyfriend was in business. During that period, he became interested in trading, so he did not sever ties with his parents and visited them in Austin every weekend, making a 2-hour trip. It seemed that everything in life was going smoothly, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. On March 2, 2018, at 4:30 a.m., Ted and Corey were awakened by the barking of dogs. In general, this was not something unusual, as the animals often actively reacted to possums or other small animals that sometimes wandered into the yard. The wife believed there was nothing to worry about, but 55-year-old Ted decided to check what the matter was. Since they lived in Texas, the man took his .45 caliber pistol with him. According to Corey, as soon as her husband went to survey the area, she put her head on the pillow and almost immediately dozed off. But just a few seconds later, the woman heard a shot from the kitchen, followed by a whole series of shots. Frightened, Corey grabbed her revolver, which was always by the bed, and ran to help her husband. In the bedroom doorway, she saw her beloved dog, shot dead. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the passageway, looking threatening. Scared, Corey opened fire, firing all 6 bullets towards the door. She didn't figure out who or what was there, and immediately after that barrage of fire, she rushed into the pantry and hid. Expecting to be found and shot, the story's heroine managed to grab her cell phone and dial 911. She reported that a killer had broken into the house and that she had shot one of the attackers. During the conversation with the dispatcher, the woman heard moans coming from somewhere in the house. The frightened Corey didn't know for sure who was making those sounds. She assumed it was her husband, wounded in the shootout, and wanted to go out to help him. But the dispatcher advised her not to leave the hiding place under any circumstances, because it could be dangerous. 15 minutes later, Corey was informed that the police were already on the scene. By that time, the moans had subsided, and a deathly silence had fallen over the house. The woman came out of the pantry and headed for the front door. Moving towards the kitchen, the woman saw her husband lying in a pool of blood with no signs of life. It seemed that the person with whom she had shared her life for 3 decades was dead. Shells were scattered around on the floor. Suppressing her fear, Corey made it to the front door and opened it, but there was no one on the doorstep. As it turned out, the police officers had confused the houses due to the unusual arrangement of the lots on this street. At that very moment, the officers were standing at the neighbor's house, trying to determine where the shots were coming from. Finally, they oriented themselves and approached the Shaughnessy family's home, where they saw a woman trembling with shock on the doorstep. She was immediately put into a police car and taken to the station. On the way, Corey called her son and informed him of his father's death. Nick and his girlfriend immediately got into the car and headed towards his parents' house. They arrived in town around 8 in the morning and met with the mother, whose life had turned into ruins overnight. The woman still couldn't comprehend what had happened, but she realized that her husband was gone. For the next 3 months, the son and Jackie lived in the house with the mother, providing her with much-needed support. Everyone who knew the family was shocked by the tragedy. The victim was described as a good-natured man who had worked hard all his life and undoubtedly deserved to live to a ripe old age. No one could have imagined that he had deadly enemies capable of shooting him point-blank in the middle of the night. Rumors immediately spread that the attack was caused by the elderly couple's wealth, as the house contained many valuables. Law enforcement officials thoroughly examined the crime scene. 2 types of shell casings were found there, .40 and .380 caliber. Obviously, 2 attackers had shot at Ted with different weapons. Although no signs of a break-in were found, an open window with a removed screen was discovered in the far bedroom. It appears that the criminals entered the house through it. On the windowsill, forensic specialists were lucky to find a fingerprint, which was immediately sent to the lab for examination. In the same room where Nick used to live and where the burglars probably ended up, there was a cabinet with a sliding drawer for a .40 caliber pistol. The weapon itself was not there. It turned out to be the only thing missing from the house. Considering that the caliber matched one of the guns used during the massacre, the detectives assumed that it was the one used to kill the owner. After talking to the Shaughnessy family and their neighbors, the police found out that everyone around knew about the jewelry store owned by the couple. In fact, it was quite a serious business, the value of which was estimated at millions of dollars. The widow of the deceased, his son, and Nick's girlfriend Jackie handed over their cell phones to investigators. Since the family was wealthy, the version of a connection with a criminal who might eliminate all family members one by one was considered. The officers assumed that they were all in great danger, so the detectives acted as quickly as possible. Nicholas had an alibi. At the time of the attack, he was 2 hours' drive away from his parents' house. His phone was then recorded in the College Station area. The house had a security system operated through a mobile app. Since the boys' parents were not very tech-savvy, Nick set up the equipment for them. Interestingly, on the night of the shooting, the security system was found to be turned off, which immediately aroused suspicion. According to the young man, there was nothing unusual about this. When his mother and father stayed at home together, sometimes they simply did not turn on the security system, although even in sleep mode it could provide some information. Investigators were able to establish that the criminals could have entered the house at 4:27 a.m., that's when the electronics were deactivated. The next signal came at 4:44, meaning the attacker was in the house for about 17 minutes. There were rumors that jewelry worth millions of dollars could be stored there, so the burglars were probably trying to find it. In addition to gold, there were safes and expensive items in the house, but none of them were missing, so the robbery version seemed unlikely. Moreover, the criminal clearly had more knowledge about his victims than a random thief, since he managed to find the gun that was later presumably used during the shootout. The behavior of the dogs raised even more questions. How could they not hear or sense the strangers and not raise the alarm for 17 minutes? Usually, the animals would start barking even when an unfamiliar car stopped in the driveway. Something was clearly wrong here. Nicholas shared an interesting story with the police that happened in the 90s. At that time, his father owned a video store, which was once broken into by armed robbers. The criminals opened fire, but Ted did not lose his head and used his own weapon. He managed to wound one of the criminals. Both attackers were later sentenced to imprisonment for attempted armed robbery. The son suggested that they might have been released and decided to take revenge. A check of the information showed that the men had indeed been released from prison shortly before the bloody tragedy. However, it was proven that at the time of the massacre of Ted, both suspects were far from the crime scene and had a solid alibi. Nicholas actively shared various guesses with the police. Another version he voiced concerned revenge on the part of a neighbor, carried out by mistake. A private detective had been following this man for a long time at the request of his wife, and even installed a tracking device on his car. Thanks to this, it was possible to expose the unfaithful husband's infidelity, after which the woman initiated a divorce process, hoping to benefit from the situation. It was not ruled out that the offended man wanted to take revenge, but confused the houses. This could have happened in the same way as with the police officers who first arrived at the neighbor's house when Nicholas' mother called for help. Later, this lead also turned out to be dead-end. The first among the suspects was the 58-year-old widow of the deceased. In fact, the family's house contained about 24 pistols, placed in special safes on all floors, in almost every room. Such an excessive amount of weapons did not cause surprise, as it was explained by the large valuables stored in the house. Suspicions were also raised by the fact that the wife was the sole beneficiary of Ted's life insurance policy. The woman was entitled to receive $1 million. And indeed, shortly after her husband's death, Corey contacted the insurance company with a demand to pay the money. She argued that Ted was the face of their business, and now, in these difficult conditions, things had gone downhill without him. Sales volumes had plummeted, customers had begun to turn away, and there were problems with suppliers. It was the sudden need for money that forced the widow to contact the insurers as soon as possible. However, they refused to pay Corey, because by that time she was already considered a suspect in the murder of her own husband. That's how the woman found out that she had come under the sights of the investigation, which greatly outraged her. According to Corey, the initiative to buy numerous pistols belonged to her late husband. She herself used only one for self-defense, the revolver she fired on the night of Ted's murder. Ballistic examination did not confirm that the shots that killed the man were fired from Corey's weapon. But despite this, during that period she came under the close attention of investigators. Cars without license plates regularly visited the house. Obviously, the woman was being watched. The son of the deceased and his fiancée were also considered suspects. When law enforcement officers searched Nick and Jackie's home, they came across a marriage certificate. It turned out that the young couple had secretly married 8 months ago without their parents' knowledge. Nicholas' mother found out about this only from the police. The news came as a complete surprise to the woman, who had never approved of her son's choice. Jackie first appeared on the doorstep of their home back in 2016. But only after Ted's death did Corey realize that now they needed to stick together. She sincerely accepted her daughter-in-law into the family, even giving her a gold diamond jewelry piece as a wedding gift. From then on, Nicholas and his wife began working in the family jewelry store, replacing the deceased father. It seemed that this would help them to escape from the bitter loss, and also support the widowed Corey during a difficult period. Meanwhile, the results of the analysis of the fingerprint found on the window of the Shaughnessy house came in. It turned out that it belonged to a worker who had installed windows there at one time and apparently left a trace during the installation. Interestingly, in fact, that man did not even live in Texas, his home was in Minnesota. In addition, he had an unshakable alibi. Despite this, the police could not reject the version of the window as a possible point of entry for the criminal into the house. One of the detectives noticed that during interrogations, Nick repeatedly mentioned how he himself used the window when he returned home tipsy after parties or simply did not want to disturb his parents who were already asleep. And this was despite the fact that the investigators never hinted to him that it was through the window that the criminals had presumably reached the house. During one of the interrogations, Nicholas spoke about his best friend Spencer, with whom he had been close friends for many years. The young man often visited the Shaughnessy house. At the same time, he came from a poorer family and hated his job, so, according to Nick, he could envy his wealthier and happier friend. From Nicholas, Spencer knew how to get into the house, because that window was usually left open. Nick assumed that it was through it that the criminals got inside. In addition, Spencer had been a guest at the Shaughnessy's more than once, so he knew where the family safes and gun cabinets were located. During one of the interrogations, Nicholas admitted that he had previously given his friend a .380 caliber pistol. Thus, the theory coincided with one of the murder weapons, the shell casings of which were found at the scene of the massacre. The detectives decided to question Spencer. He confirmed that he knew almost everything about the Shaughnessy family and had indeed been to their house many times. He even provided the police with the .380 caliber pistol given to him by Nick. The seized pistol was sent for ballistic examination. The results showed that it was not fired during the murder. Eventually, Spencer was excluded from the circle of suspects, but it was he who led the police to think about the involvement of Nicholas himself in the crime. Law enforcement officers could not help but notice how actively the victim's son offered them various versions, none of which were ultimately confirmed. Could the adopted son of the businessman be involved in his death? Is he capable of killing a person who had done so much for him? It was on the example of the situation with Spencer that investigators suspected the ominous plan of the criminal. Nick portrayed his friend's life as a complete routine that he was supposedly tired of. In addition, Shaughnessy's son gave his buddy a pistol of the same caliber, the shell casings of which were found at the scene of the massacre. Nicholas himself told the police about the window. All this seemed too precise to be a coincidence. Throughout the investigation, Nick repeatedly drew attention to himself with strange behavior. The day after the murder, he personally went to the neighbors and asked them various questions. It seemed as if the young man was trying to take the investigation into his own hands. When everyone who was present in the Shaughnessy house at the time of the tragedy had their fingerprints and DNA samples taken, Nicholas was surprisingly cheerful. He was shaking with excitement. Having returned to his parents' home, Nick immediately went to the same window through which the criminals had presumably entered. The young man studied the frame for a long time but said nothing. In fact, it turned out that the young man had serious financial difficulties. Trading was not bringing in money, and Nicholas was spending all the funds his parents gave him on it. His own business had come to a dead end, and despite this, he was not going to look for a job. For a long time, his mother and father supported their son, paid all the bills, but at the same time expected that the young man would finally begin to take care of himself independently. Shortly before the tragedy, they lent their adopted son $30,000 as a fund to pay for his future college education. However, Nick was not planning to either enroll or get an education. He simply spent the money on trading and other needs. After that, his parents refused to provide financial assistance, hoping to encourage him to start building a career in his own life. That is why Ted and Corey insisted that the young couple live separately. They believed that living together with a girl would benefit Nicholas, and he would think about going to college, as Jackie had done. Instead, he borrowed another $5,000 from a family friend, still did not find a job, and continued to bet on trading. But it was all in vain. As the police found out, Nick never returned the debt, which became a common occurrence for him. It was obvious to his parents that this way of life would not help their son get on his feet. So the detectives assumed that it was the financial issue that could have become the motive for the brutal attack. However, Nicholas had an alibi. Perhaps the adopted son did not shoot Ted with his own hands, but for this, he could hire perpetrators. To check this version, the investigators visited Nick and Jackie's house again. This time, they found several boxes of cartridges there, the brands and calibers of which coincided with the shell casings found at the scene of the murder. Moreover, exactly 6 rounds from the box were missing. Soon the police managed to expose another lie of the suspect. Previously, Nicholas claimed that he had not visited his parents for a long time, but the cops found out that a couple of days before the tragedy, on February 28, he still came to his parents' house. The young man denied this, but the investigators found indisputable proof of his deception. Interestingly, 2 days before the attack on Ted, a large gap appeared in the messengers on Nick and Jackie's cell phones. Naturally, the lovers constantly kept in touch through messages and calls, but during that period they did not write a single word to each other. After checking the couple's phones, the police found that they had been thoroughly cleaned shortly before the start of the investigation. It seemed as if many messages had been edited or deleted altogether, and the devices themselves had been reset to factory settings. However, despite such foresight, Nicholas and Jackie did not take one thing into account: all the information was duplicated on the computer. When the police finally managed to gain access to the couple's incriminating correspondence, it became clear why they were in such a hurry to get rid of traces on their phones. It turned out that their financial situation was much worse than Nick had told his parents. The detectives decided to interrogate Spencer again, because they felt that he was hiding something. Indeed, the young man confessed that shortly before the massacre, Nicholas had offered him money for the murder of his own parents. By carrying out this plan, Nick could count on an inheritance of about $8 million, taking into account all the property acquired thanks to the family business. Spencer claimed that he would also receive part of this amount, but refused to participate in the crime. After that, Nicholas allegedly threatened to kill him if his friend blabbed. Corey, despite all the family feuds with her son, refused to believe it. Therefore, to protect Nick, she hired the best lawyer in the district. The woman was convinced that her son, like herself, had become a victim of police arbitrariness. After all, in the initial stages of the investigation, Corey was also considered one of the suspects. On May 29, 2018, Nicholas and Jackie were arrested on charges of incitement to murder. According to state law, this crime was punishable by the death penalty. Corey still believed that a fatal mistake had occurred, because she did not know about the evidence that law enforcement officials had. When Jackie was released on bail 2 months later, the widowed woman decided that the case against her son was also about to fall apart. The loving mother hoped to see Nick at liberty soon, but things turned out differently. Investigators managed to track down the real criminals who directed the actions of hired killers while being 2 hours' drive away from the Shaughnessy family's house. Detectives found surveillance camera footage from February 28. It captured 2 unknown men, one of whom worked for a window installation company. It was his fingerprint that was found at the beginning of the investigation, but the suspect had a reliable alibi. After contacting the window company, the police found out that this employee's name was Cameron Vosmek. They visited him again at his home, but the man himself was not there. Instead, the cops talked to his wife, who immediately stated that she knew why the police had come to them. The woman reported that Cameron had refused to participate in the crime, but his 21-year-old colleague John Miller might be involved. Law enforcement officers quickly found John. At first, he denied any role in the tragic events, but then confessed that Nicholas had promised him $100,000 for killing his parents. Miller continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that he had gone to the Shaughnessy house together with Nick, who had personally dealt with his father, and John had only helped him. Specialists checked the data from the suspect's cell phone. It turned out that at about the time of the murder, he was in the area of the crime scene. Eventually, the young man admitted his complicity and even asked for the death penalty for himself, because he could no longer bear the burden of guilt. According to John, he fired from the pistol given to him by Nicholas. It was the same .40 caliber weapon that had disappeared from the Shaughnessy couple's house. During the investigation, it was proven that the adopted son had personally turned off the security system in his parents' home. Upon learning this, Corey finally realized what a monster she had actually raised. The woman could no longer deny the involvement of her adopted son in the crime. But what shocked her the most was that for 3 months after her husband's death, she had lived under the same roof with a person who was actually planning to send her to the other world as well. When the revelations were just beginning, Nick suddenly stated that his father had been suffering from depression for a long time, so his son allegedly did him a favor by taking his life. The widowed Corey called this an outright lie, because Ted had never had any problems with his mental health or emotional state. Jackie repeatedly denied any involvement in the murder, did not acknowledge the existence of Ted's depression, and also categorically refused to admit that she knew anything at all about Nicholas' plans. The girl denied everything until the last moment and refused to cooperate with the investigation. She was only trying to avoid responsibility, but later it was proven that this was all a lie. Jackie did not directly participate in the crime, but she knew about it. And, as she later stated herself, she tried to dissuade Nick from the terrible plan, but to no avail. However, no one believed this, because the girl could have informed the police about her husband's criminal intentions, but she did not do so. She was released on bail only because Jackie agreed to cooperate with the investigation and testify against Nicholas. After that, she simply continued to live her life. She went to college, attended parties, as if forgetting about Nick's fate. All this time, the police managed to track down Arian Smith, the second man who shot at Ted. Both he and Nicholas could have received the death penalty, but they made a deal with the investigation. In April 2021, both pleaded guilty to a less serious crime. In exchange, they received 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole from June 2023. The criminals are still behind bars. Jackie got off even easier thanks to her cooperation with law enforcement. She was sentenced to 4 months in prison and 10 years of probation. Corey's life was completely shattered. She never recovered from the terrible shock. The woman still writes letters to her son in prison, but she cannot find the strength to send even one of them. Life can often be deceiving, and the people we encounter along our path may turn out to be entirely different from what they seem at first glance. Take a closer look at your friends or neighbors. Perhaps some of them behave strangely, and their actions can't always be explained away by simple jokes or idle chatter. This story is about the stark changes in a person that society noticed too late. Many people dedicate their entire lives to building a career, a home, and a business. When everything is going smoothly, it seems like nothing can stand in the way of success. However, even the most well-ordered life can come under threat, and naturally, everyone will try to protect their loved ones. But sometimes, this struggle goes too far. Michael Barisone, a native of the United States, was born on August 17, 1964. He gained fame as a talented equestrian coach, becoming an Olympic champion and a true legend in his field. Michael eagerly shared his wealth of experience and skill in working with horses. Everyone who entered the equestrian world after him dreamed of training under his guidance. However, becoming Michael's student was no easy feat, as he only worked with the most promising athletes. Michael confidently joined the ranks of the best riders in the USA and represented the national team at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. After this triumph, he firmly established his status as an unrivaled master of his craft and became an outstanding coach, a role model for many of his colleagues. He truly reached incredible heights before finding himself at the center of one of the most high-profile and controversial court cases in recent years. Michael Barisone owned 2 large horse farms. One of them was located near Palm Beach in Florida, while the other, known as Hawthorne Hill, was situated in Washington Township, New Jersey. It was there that the champion most often held training sessions with his students. March 2018 marked the arrival of a new student at Hawthorne Hill, 37-year-old Lauren Kanarek. Although she didn't have any notable athletic achievements or a long list of accolades, Lauren belonged to the ranks of promising equestrian enthusiasts and stood out for her determination. Despite the lack of high-profile victories, she passionately dreamed of triumphs and was truly obsessed with this idea. Soon, Lauren not only began training with the legendary mentor but also brought 5 of her own horses to Hawthorne Hill. She rented a house on Michael's farm and put all her efforts into improving her horsemanship skills. For Lauren, who was an amateur rider, the opportunity to learn from a true world-class virtuoso was a unique chance. Usually, Michael's students mostly trained under the guidance of his assistants, but the situation with Lauren turned out differently. She demanded the coach's undivided attention. As with other amateurs, Michael planned to pair Lauren with his assistants for independent lessons without his participation, but the girl insisted that the Olympic champion himself conduct the training. Of course, this created certain difficulties, as the hero of our story had a multitude of important matters to attend to and couldn't devote all his time to a single student. Moreover, there was no urgent need for this, since Lauren had not yet mastered all the basic skills that Michael's assistants could teach her. Only after that could she learn the nuances and intricacies of mastery from the champion himself. In the end, to avoid conflicts, Michael often had to train Lauren personally. By the summer of 2019, the situation had noticeably deteriorated. Lauren, who had always been known for her quarrelsome nature, became even more impudent and impulsive. Several trainers and assistants worked at Hawthorne Hill, as well as maintenance staff who cared for the horses and the farm. They all began to notice changes in Lauren's behavior. In her opinion, the main reason for her dissatisfaction was the insufficiently high quality of training provided by Michael's assistants and the Olympic champion himself. However, other students never expressed any complaints about the trainers, so all of Lauren's grievances seemed far-fetched and unfounded. In his time, Michael Barisone had followed a similar path, the one he was now leading his students along. He also trained under the supervision of champions' assistants before earning their support. Other well-known athletes, such as Michael Poulin, rallied around Barisone. They saw the thorny road he had traveled on his way to the podium before becoming one of the most respected representatives of equestrian sports in the world. Michael Barisone was an active and energetic individual. That's how other athletes, with whom he later competed in various tournaments, remembered him. Michael was a brilliant rider and later became an equally outstanding coach. His professionalism was highly valued by dozens of students. All this attracted more and more people to him, people who wanted to at least get a glimpse of the secrets of his unparalleled talent. In addition to professional sports, this extra activity allowed Michael to acquire, rebuild, and maintain 2 wonderful farms. There were many horses and employees who cared for them, as well as, of course, students, some of whom even rented premises on the farm's territory. There were quite a few of Michael's former students for whom these words were not just empty talk. Many of them sincerely thanked him for the fact that, thanks to his guidance, they were able to significantly improve their athletic skills, and some even achieved real success. Michael Barisone's farm was open not only to wealthy clients willing to pay for training. There was a spacious stable on the premises that constantly required working hands. To ensure the completion of necessary tasks, Michael occasionally invited those who wanted to learn the art of horseback riding. He even attended amateur competitions, scouting for young talents and potential employees there. For young people, it was a great opportunity to get in touch with the world of horses under the guidance of a true master. Occasionally, students and high schoolers would show up at the farm. Considering the high cost of the coach's services, such an opportunity seemed like a fairly profitable offer for anyone who wanted to develop in equestrian sports. Lauren Kanarek had dedicated her entire life to horseback riding. She had achieved, in her opinion, considerable success and dreamed of getting support and training from the best specialists. Fate brought her together with Michael Barisone. The coach was impressed by Lauren's persistence and determination. In her behavior, he saw a reflection of his younger self when he was full of determination to climb onto the podium and become the best. Lauren was a petite and fragile woman who had sincerely fallen in love with horses from early childhood. Over time, these noble animals turned into a real passion for her. Lauren's childhood and teenage years were spent on a small horse farm in Ellington, Florida. This love sparked in her heart when she was only 2 years old. After her very first encounter with horses, the girl could no longer get these magnificent creatures out of her head. Lauren's father, John Kanarek, was a fairly wealthy and successful man. He had worked on Wall Street for many years. At the time of the events described, John had already retired and was running his own business. From the very beginning, he noticed that his daughter had an extraordinary love for horses. John decided to support Lauren's passion in every possible way, even though he himself was far from this sphere. He financed the construction of a stable on their farm. For his little daughter, John bought a pony that she could start her first training sessions on. This became a real milestone for Lauren. Almost immediately, the girl began to confidently hold herself in the saddle. Essentially, horseback riding is a dance performed by animals together with the rider. Initial lessons help to achieve harmony and learn to feel your horse. Lauren mastered these skills with surprising ease. John Canarek didn't fully understand the point of such training, but he tried with all his might to support his daughter's interest. Lauren intensely engaged in horseback riding, gradually transitioning from her ponies to full-sized horses. She began to participate in amateur competitions. Slowly, she managed to demonstrate considerable professionalism, although her technique still needed improvement. Lauren's first victory took place in Belmont, where she won first place. In fact, the acquaintance with Michael Barisone happened through another person. Once, Olympic medalist Stephen Colbert was holding a meeting with amateurs and professionals of equestrian sports at his farm. He decided to give a couple of lessons to beginners and was sincerely impressed by Lauren's skill. That day, Michael Barisone happened to be at Colbertone's farm as well. He became an involuntary witness to Lauren's training session, during which she sought to demonstrate her skills to Stephen. Apparently, the champion saw great potential in Lauren. After her performance, Michael invited the girl to come to his farm for training. Of course, Lauren accepted such an offer from an athlete of international level with incredible enthusiasm. Soon after, she was already happily arriving at Barisone's farm for a training session. Michael praised Lauren, and she asked for permission to become his student. Michael agreed to help the girl. This is how the complicated relationship between Lauren and Michael began, which later affected the lives of everyone who lived and worked on the farm. From the very beginning, Michael Barisone set the standard rate for Lauren, $5,000 a month. Under these conditions, she arrived at Hawthorne Hill along with her 5 horses. Considering that Lauren found herself far from her home, Michael agreed to provide her with housing for free. Lauren quickly oriented herself and decided to bring her boyfriend, Robert Goodwin, with her. Michael allocated a separate 2-story house for the couple, built on the farm's territory. It was located a couple of hundred meters from the owner's own residence. Later, Michael recounted that all of this was the result of his many years of work. Michael Barisone managed to build a brilliant career, winning numerous awards and earning considerable wealth. He invested all the money he earned into the development of his own business. In fact, Michael had never before trained any student under such special conditions. He didn't raise the cost of training, even though the young couple occupied a spacious house on his farm. Of course, Michael had to pay the bills for the house, which could have brought in additional rental income. However, fascinated by Lauren's skill, the man turned a blind eye to this and didn't demand a higher fee. In fact, from that point on, Lauren and her boyfriend began living on the farm together with the Olympic champion. Lauren's father paid $5,000 a month. It was quite a modest sum, considering the high quality of training, the care for the girls' horses, and the opportunity to live there. In Lauren's father's opinion, it was a favorable deal. Obviously, for that kind of money, his daughter was unlikely to find a coach of similar level. Unfortunately, Lauren's own behavior was far from grateful. At the same time, several other people lived on the farm. Among them was Justin Harden, an assistant trainer, as well as Mary Haskins Gray, who helped Michael. The woman was divorced and later became not only Michael's business partner but also his life companion. Mary was also connected to sports and participated in the Grand Prix, for which she trained under Michael Barisone's guidance. At the same time, she worked as an assistant and trainer in his stable. Mary had 2 children, and from the first days of living together, Michael accepted them as his own. They had a wonderful relationship. Mary described Michael as an extremely decent and kind person. Her children simply adored the man, and he reciprocated their affection. In fact, they became a real family. The Olympic champion's life flowed smoothly and calmly, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. Lauren was an active Facebook user and immediately began posting photos with her coach. She made posts about horses and Michael, but gradually the situation began to change in a strange way. Already in the first summer, some unpleasant tension appeared in the relationship with the student. Michael Barisone repeatedly mentioned that Lauren sought his undivided attention. Of course, the man was quite busy and couldn't always accompany the girl during all her horse training sessions. At the same time, Lauren categorically refused to work with Michael's assistants. Despite the fact that the assistants were also highly skilled professionals, Mary and Justin noticed that Lauren always expressed dissatisfaction when they substituted for Michael. Mary, who was in a romantic relationship with Barisone, reacted particularly negatively to her behavior. Mary believed that Lauren was behaving like a rival trying to draw all the mentor's attention to herself. Due to the capricious student's whims, the atmosphere on the farm began to deteriorate, and reasons for conflicts became more and more frequent. Lauren began to ponder the fact that the money her father was investing in her training was being wasted. At the same time, she completely ignored the fact that she was actually living for free on the Olympic champion's territory, who had kindly provided a roof over her head, her boyfriend, and her horses. The tension continued until June 2019, when the woman's discontent erupted into an open conflict. Lauren frankly expressed her indignation to Mary about the head coach's behavior. She believed that she was paying to work with the best of the best, not with his assistants. Mary regarded this as a true manifestation of jealousy. Lauren, on the other hand, was convinced that everyone else on the farm was just a pale shadow of Barisone, so they would never be able to turn her into a true champion. Despite this, she was actually far from ideal and didn't even possess the basic horseback riding skills. In the end, Lauren discussed this issue with Michael. The man tried to explain to the student that such a practice, when the coach's assistants work with the trainees, is the norm in their environment. Moreover, he noted that the money Lauren's father pays for training is a fairly modest sum for the services of assistants of this level. Michael emphasized that Lauren and her boyfriend were living on the farm's territory for free, and he wasn't charging any additional rent. Lauren had nothing to object to, but she harbored resentment and wasn't going to keep silent. At the beginning of 2019, she published a provocative post on her social media page. Lauren spoke negatively about Michael's work and his farm in general. Thus began the creation of an unpleasant image of Hawthorne Hill. In her social media posts, Lauren began to vividly describe how deeply disappointed she was with Michael. She had expected much more, but in her opinion, Barisone had not coped with his task. Similar publications began to appear more and more frequently. The first provocative posts by Lauren appeared back in 2018, but at first, no one paid attention to them. Gradually, the woman became more and more aggressive in her publications. In addition, she informed her father that the horses might be in danger. Of course, this alarmed the man, because the animals themselves were quite expensive. Lauren tried to convince her father that the horses were not being properly cared for. Allegedly, because of this, she began to have problems sleeping, as she feared for the animals' lives. The girl claimed that the horses were being fed incorrectly, and they had even started to look sickly. Later it turned out that all this was a complete fabrication, but it was no longer possible to stop the spread of lies. Michael and his assistants didn't even suspect what was happening until it was too late. However, Lauren wasn't going to limit herself to just lies. Together with her boyfriend, she decided to secretly install audio recording devices on the farm. The woman collected information and began publishing unpleasant posts, taking Michael's ambiguous phrases out of context. According to sports etiquette, all this could lead to serious consequences. The Olympic champion began to be removed from participation in sports events. Given how acutely such issues are perceived in American society, Lauren's actions provoked a wave of indignation against Michael. The man, stunned by the sudden attacks on the internet, tried to refute all these baseless accusations. The student's behavior dealt a devastating blow to the Olympic champion's reputation. His supporters feared that, against the backdrop of the accusations, Michael's business could suffer significant losses or even find itself on the brink of complete collapse. During this period, Lauren and her boyfriend Robert Goodwin, despite the discontent and constant conflicts, continued to rent one of the houses on the farm's territory. They categorically refused to leave this place, despite Michael's demands. Barisone insisted that the couple get out, he no longer wanted to see them. But Lauren and Robert stubbornly ignored all his demands. Michael even turned to the police about this. The Olympic champion began to seriously fear for his own life. Unfortunately, law enforcement officers simply ignored all his appeals, regarding the conflict as an ordinary dispute between a landlord and tenants. No one could even imagine that the situation would go this far. Meanwhile, the atmosphere on the farm kept deteriorating. During this period, many people noticed a serious deterioration in the Olympic champion's emotional state. Michael even began to look worse and became like his own shadow. He accused the student of creating intolerable conditions in his own house. At that point, Barisone did not yet suspect the existence of hidden audio recording devices. In fact, Lauren launched a real persecution campaign against Michael on the territory of the farm that belonged to the man himself. At the same time, she brazenly accused the coach of bullying her. Considering Lauren's fragile physique and the Olympic champion's powerful muscular build, the girl's words sounded quite convincing. No one could even imagine that such a sweet-looking woman was simply making up all these terrible stories. The situation escalated even further when Michael's beloved, Mary, could not withstand the constant pressure and moved out of the farmhouse with her children. Barisone was furious with this turn of events. Of course, this could not go on for long. In the end, the mentor informed Lauren and Robert that they had to get out along with their horses. To his surprise, the young people flatly refused to do so. Michael even turned to Lauren's father for help. But he clearly sided with his daughter, so he ignored the Olympic champion's request to take the girl away from the farm. John Kanarek insisted that the money paid for training had not yet been fully worked off. Barisone felt trapped, he didn't know what to do next. On June 31, 2019, the famous athlete filed another police report. He described the entire situation in detail and asked for help from law enforcement officers. However, his appeal was ignored again, with the incident being regarded as an ordinary rental dispute. The police advised Michael to solve his problems on his own and not bother officers with trifles. Barisone once again approached Lauren and Robert, demanding they leave the farm. But once more, the couple categorically refused. Similar requests were made repeatedly after that, but the residents of the comfortable house stubbornly refused to leave the territory. According to Michael, the situation was getting worse and worse. It seemed that Lauren knew absolutely everything about him, followed his every step, and did not hesitate to use any opportunity to smear the man on social media. However, there was one thing Lauren didn't know: the Olympic champion had a gun safe in his work office where he kept a pistol. Of course, his nerves and patience were not infinite. The student had created such intolerable conditions that the man developed serious problems with sleep and his personal life. He lost his appetite, emotional stability, and became extremely irritable. Michael, extremely dissatisfied with this attitude, decided to focus on Lauren's training. At the same time, he realized how much damage the student's behavior was causing to his business. Financial difficulties only exacerbated the situation. Even at this stage, Lauren did not stop her attacks and began sending threats to Michael. After that, he turned to the police again. Unfortunately, his statement was ignored, just like all the previous ones. In fact, at that point, Lauren had only just begun her ominous game. On August 7, 2019, she decided that she had gathered enough compromising information about her mentor and made it public on social media. After that, Lauren filed a complaint with the Child Protection Services, accusing Mary of cruel treatment of children. An investigation was also launched against Mary herself. Throughout this time, Lauren's father did not intervene in the situation at all. But even this act was not the end of the insidious plan. The woman appealed to the Congress on sports safety and complained about Michael. She delivered a loud speech in which she accused the athlete of harassment, stalking, abuse, and violence against her. Of course, this was a complete lie. Despite the availability of audio recordings of all conversations on the farm, no evidence of her words was found. In light of the accusations, social workers were intent on taking the children away, but by that time, Mary was no longer living at Hawthorne Hill Farm. The Olympic champion was facing real sanctions and restrictions, as well as a deterioration in relations with the entire sports community. His business, deprived of new clients, was on the verge of bankruptcy. After these events, Michael went to his city office, where Mary was having a meeting with a social worker. The issue of removing the children was being resolved, since the coach's assistant was also mentioned in Lauren's complaints. Michael and his girlfriend were in despair. He put his beloved in the car and asked her to wait a few minutes. The man went into the office, opened the safe, took out the gun, and loaded it. From that moment on, as Michael later claimed, he remembered nothing except the road to the farm. It was as if his memory had been erased. In reality, Barisone immediately headed to the farm, as soon as he dropped his girlfriend and the social worker off at Mary's apartment, where the children were. Arriving at Hawthorne Hill, Michael approached the house where Lauren and her boyfriend Robert lived. What happened next is not exactly known. At 2:13 p.m., Lauren called the 911 emergency service. Gasping for air, she reported being attacked. At that time, Robert was fighting with Michael. The woman begged the police to come as soon as possible, because she was wounded and could barely breathe. Lauren had been shot several times. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they saw the girl with 2 gunshot wounds to the left side of her chest. Next to her on the ground lay Michael Barisone, who had been neutralized by Robert and the couple's dog. All the participants in the incident were brutally beaten, blood was flowing from Lauren. Michael had suffered a heavy blow to the head and lost consciousness. The police officer who arrived at the scene turned Barisone over, who was lying face down. The man was alive. A pink and black 9mm Ruger pistol was found on the ground next to his left hand. The weapon was immediately seized for examination. The ambulance that arrived at the call took Lauren and the other victims. Now the injured student was desperately fighting for her own life. Her condition was critical, so the doctors put the girl into an artificial coma. This was necessary because, due to significant blood loss, there was a serious risk of brain damage. Lauren was connected to life support machines. Michael suffered beatings but did not receive any serious injuries. The very next day, he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. The man claimed that he did not remember anything about the events of that day. Barisone admitted that he had never been prone to aggression or anger, so he considered the incident another staging by Lauren. Thus began the trial in Morris County, New Jersey, which dragged on for 3 whole years. The hearings in the case were scheduled for the end of March 2022. Michael spent most of this time behind bars without the right to bail but desperately begged for help. He persistently argued that he had become a victim of his own student, who had turned into a real stalker and unleashed a war in his own home. During this period, Lauren also defended her position. She spent 4 days in an artificial coma, and then 3 more weeks in the intensive care unit. The victim was connected to life support devices and couldn't even speak due to an intubation tube in her throat. In fact, the girl was 1 step away from death, but the doctors managed to snatch her from the other world. Now Lauren was determined to put Michael behind bars for life by any means possible. According to the victim, Barisone was hiding behind a bush near the back porch. When Lauren approached him, not even suspecting he had a gun, she started a conversation. Suddenly, the man raised his weapon and fired at her twice. Robert, Lauren's boyfriend, claimed that he was nearby and saw with his own eyes how Michael shot the girl. Then Barisone tried to shoot at him too but missed. Then Robert rushed at the attacker and neutralized him. The Olympic champion's lawyer insisted on the innocence of his client, citing temporary insanity and a state of passion provoked by Lauren's behavior and the connivance of her boyfriend. Michael had indeed suffered greatly from all these events. Michael lost his reputation, clientele, and to ensure proper defense in court, he was forced to sell Hawthorne Hill Farm, which he had built from scratch with his own hands, investing all his money and soul into it. His relationship with Mary was ruined, as the woman feared for the fate of her children and was afraid that the custody service would take them away. However, Mary became a valuable witness for the defense. In court, she spoke about the terror that Lauren had unleashed in the summer of 2019. The woman described in detail how the student had come up with increasingly cruel methods of revenge against the coach and other mentors because of her own jealousy. Lauren and Robert had long wanted to evict them from the farm, especially after the flood when the utility building was flooded. But the young couple refused to leave. Michael, Mary, and the children were forced to move into the barn while their living quarters were being repaired, and Lauren and her boyfriend didn't even let them into the house where they were mere guests. Mary claimed that Lauren and her boyfriend had not kept their word and had not left the farm's territory even after the training was over. Instead, they continued to live in someone else's house as imposters. That's why Michael had repeatedly turned to the police because of the illegal seizure of the house, but to no avail. At the same time, Mary insisted that until the very end, Barisone had been an ideal man and a wonderful father, even to non-biological children. Mary and Michael had a long history of relations. In his time, he became her coach and helped her ascend to the podium of honor and get to the Olympic Games. The woman described Barisone as a wonderful mentor and trainer who had preserved the best human qualities and cared for her. Another assistant coach, Justin Harding, also appeared in court and confirmed that Lauren had been difficult to deal with. The defense attorney's strategy of declaring the defendant insane was quite risky, as such a line of defense is rarely used. Michael's condition required close attention, so a top-category forensic psychiatrist and several independent experts were involved to assess his mental health. They spent many hours in conversations with the former Olympic champion. The doctors really assumed that Lauren could have done everything that Michael and Mary had told them about. The man's emotional state deteriorated under the pressure of the terror campaign launched against him, until he reached a critical point. Barisone had never been prone to aggression or cruelty, but despite this, circumstances forced him to resort to weapons. There were other reasons for memory loss as well. In fact, Michael recalled taking the gun, loading it, and going to the farm. The man insisted that he had no intention of killing anyone, but at some point, a fight broke out with Lauren's boyfriend. Robert dealt a heavy blow to Michael's head, and this, according to doctors, could have caused amnesia. In addition to Barisone, close attention was also paid to Lauren. During one of the testimonies, the girl admitted that she wanted to destroy her coach's business. The reason for this was jealousy and disappointment. She believed that she would be able to become the best of the best, but these hopes were not fulfilled. Michael was convinced the tragedy could have been avoided if the young people had not resorted to bullying on the internet, had immediately obeyed him, and had gotten out of someone else's house. Moreover, many questions were raised by the police's attitude towards this incident and the behavior of Lauren's father. In total, Michael officially turned to law enforcement officers 4 times with a request to help resolve the conflict, but not once did his statements arouse proper interest. The inaction of law enforcement officials ultimately led to the tragedy. After almost 3 weeks of hearings, the jury went to the deliberation room to reach a verdict. Michael faced up to 80 years in prison. Consideration of all the circumstances of the case took about 4 days. In the end, the sentence was passed. 58-year-old Michael Barisone was found insane. The defendant, overwhelmed with emotion, hugged his lawyer through tears. The defense team could not hold back their sobs, calling it a triumph of justice. A few weeks later, Barisone was transferred to a psychiatric clinic for a course of treatment. In November 2023, the Olympic champion was released, but from now on, he must undergo regular checkups and treatment. Currently, Michael lives on his second farm in Florida. Barisone received wide support from the equestrian community and his friends, but the supervisory organizations still suspend him from participating in competitions. For Lauren, the verdict was a real shock. She was sure that she had managed to completely ruin not only the coach's business but also his life. Kanarek does not give up trying to bring the mentor to justice. She hired a civil lawyer to file a lawsuit against the eminent athlete. Lauren now lives in Summerfield, North Carolina, where she continues to ride horses. There are categories of people for whom married life seems to be something unattainable and unnatural. A promiscuous and disorderly lifestyle can sometimes create so many love triangles that a whole database has to be created for those suspected of a brutal crime. Festus is a small town in the state of Missouri, USA, with a population of about 10,000 residents, which can be called a kind of religious community. Almost all the locals are believers who stand out for their calmness and friendliness. It's a quiet corner where people live family lives, know each other well, and maintain strong ties. However, sometimes it is in such peaceful towns that evil manifests itself in the most terrible and cruel way. On November 21, 2000, an alarming call came into the local sheriff's office. An agitated witness reported that she had heard a shot not far from the factory and noticed a suspicious car. The woman did not dare to come closer to find out what had happened, but she was sure that the person behind the wheel was wounded. Police officers immediately went in the direction of the industrial complex. A few hundred meters from it, in the middle of a field, they found a pickup truck. From a distance, it might seem that the car had some technical problems, because the hazard lights were flashing. But when the patrol officers approached the vehicle, they saw that the windshield was broken. And inside, behind the wheel, a man was sitting motionless. He showed no signs of life, his foot still on the brake. Below lay an unfinished can of soda, which had probably fallen out of the victim's hand after the shot rang out. There was a large through-and-through hole in the deceased's skull. The bullet had passed right through and even managed to break the windshield. The man was either shot point-blank or a very powerful weapon was used. An elderly witness said that the murder had occurred literally minutes before the police arrived, as the bloodstains were still fresh and continuing to flow onto the car floor. Officers called for backup, and in the meantime conducted a preliminary inspection of the scene. They assumed that the driver had been shot from the back seat, as the bullet had pierced the headrest. As it turned out, the car belonged to 39-year-old Larry Holman. It looked like he was the one who had been shot in the car. The victim's face was so disfigured that additional expertise was needed for accurate identification. However, it did not take long, the medical examiner confirmed the investigators' guesses. This case turned out to be quite personal for Detective Randy, who arrived at the crime scene. He had previously worked together with the deceased at his previous job. The hardest part for Randy was calling Larry's loved ones and telling them what had happened. The detective also personally knew Holman's wife, Tammy, who was shocked by this terrible news. The murdered man was survived by sisters, brothers, his beloved wife Tammy, and 2 children, for whom this event was an unbearably painful blow. Randy did not tell Tammy over the phone that Larry was dead. Therefore, at first Tammy thought that her husband was alive, just wounded, and she rushed to the scene. But when she realized that Larry was gone, she fell to the ground, overcome with grief, and began to sob uncontrollably. It seemed that the whole world had collapsed for this woman in an instant. Now she was left a single mother with 2 children, without the loving husband that Larry had been to her. But in fact, this tragic chapter of the story was just beginning. Larry Holman and Tammy Duncan met at church. The girl was much younger than him, but the man fell passionately in love and began to persistently court her. At the time of their meeting, Tammy had just turned 16, and her suitor was 28 years old. By that time, he had already managed to get divorced and had a daughter from his first marriage. The romantic relationship between Larry and Tammy began immediately after she finished school. As close relatives of the couple said, they had a sincere and loving relationship. Larry's colleagues recalled that he even carried a photo of his wife in his lunchbox so that every time he sat down to lunch at work, he could see her image. There were many such touching sentimental moments in the life of this married couple. They got married, had a son, Josh, and a daughter, Natalie, were very religious people and seemed absolutely happy. At least, that was the impression they made on those around them. Larry was considered a do-gooder. Everyone described him as an extremely pleasant person in every way. The man had no bad habits or addictions, was not connected with the criminal world. It was completely incomprehensible who could wish him harm at all. The initial version of the investigation, according to which the criminal was sitting in the back seat of the car and shot the driver, was not confirmed. A detailed analysis of the car and reconstruction of the bullet's trajectory showed that the shot was fired from a fairly long distance, using a powerful ammunition. The bullet entered through the rear side window, then diagonally passed through the headrest and hit Larry in the back of the head. After being wounded in the head, the victim pressed the brake pedal, and the car stopped. The injury turned out to be fatal. The man died without even having time to realize what had happened. This is how the police officers who arrived at the call found him. The detective's first version was an accident, because hunting was allowed in this area, and the incident occurred just at the beginning of the hunting season. Moreover, given the scale of the damage, we were talking about the use of a very high-quality and powerful rifle, which hit the victim from a considerable distance. Such weapons are characteristic of hunters. It was assumed that it could have been an accident. Some clumsy hunter accidentally fired from the forest. However, a more detailed analysis showed that the shot was not fired from the forest, but from the opposite side. There were reasonable doubts as to whether the car was moving at the moment the bullet hit. Of course, there was a brake track on the road, but it was impossible to determine exactly whether Larry stopped before or after the shot. Moreover, as the police officers who were the first to arrive at the scene noted, the car's headlights were turned off. And this indicated that at the time the driver was wounded, the car was unlikely to be in motion. The wife confirmed that her husband could have left the car near the factory. So everything pointed more to an ambush than to an accident. In any case, it was unlikely that the wounded driver would waste his strength turning off the headlights. It seemed that he had stopped, and only then was he deliberately shot. Thus, the version of intentional murder appeared, but most of the law enforcement officers involved in the investigation did not really believe in it. The exception was only Detective Randy, who personally knew the deceased. It seemed that no one but him showed any particular enthusiasm in investigating this case. The investigator himself was convinced that his friend had become the victim of a carefully planned attack. Others did not want to believe it, because the area was considered very safe, and such cases had not happened here before. Over the past decade, there had not been a single murder in this area. People simply could not believe that someone could raise a hand against such a positive and friendly person as Larry Holman. However, despite this, Detective Randy intuitively felt that it was intentional murder, not an accident. He knew the deceased well and was sure that he could not have become an accidental victim. Larry was a very bright and good-natured person. It seemed incredible that he could have enemies capable of such a brutal murder. But despite this, the experienced investigator clearly understood that someone had deliberately deprived Holman of his life. It is unlikely that the wounded driver would have wasted his strength turning off the headlights. He had obviously stopped, and only then was he deliberately shot. This circumstance prompted the detectives to think about intentional murder. However, this version was not supported by most law enforcement officers involved in the investigation. The exception was only Randy, who personally knew the deceased. It seemed that no one but him showed any particular enthusiasm in finding the truth. The investigator was firmly convinced that his friend had become the victim of a carefully planned attack. Others did not really believe it, because the area was considered very safe, and such incidents had not happened here before. Over the past decade, there had not been a single murder in this area. People simply could not believe that someone could take the life of such a bright and friendly person as Larry Holman. However, this death did not seem accidental to Detective Randy. despite the incredible nature of the situation. The investigator knew Larry well and was sure that he could not have had enemies capable of such a brutal murder. Against this background, the version of a tragic accident might have looked plausible. But despite common sense, Randy felt that someone had deliberately deprived Holman of his life. In order to shed light on this complicated case, the investigator began to question everyone who was acquainted with the family of the deceased. The first people he turned to, of course, were Larry's relatives and neighbors. The man who lived in the house across the street was a close friend of Holman. He said that shortly before the murder, he had seen Larry at church. When they both came to the Sunday service with their families, the neighbor heard from his friend about some problems. Larry said that he was quitting his job, and even asked if there might be a place for him in his friend's company. The man noticed that Holman looked tense, but to all questions he only waved it off and changed the subject. The same neighbor provided the police with another piece of interesting information. It turned out that he often went hunting with Larry. The men never missed a season and went to the forest again a couple of days after meeting at church. At some point, the friends split up. And soon Larry reported over the radio that he had been shot at. Holman gave his location, and the neighbor rushed to help. As the man was walking to the agreed point to pick up Larry from the forest, he noticed a stranger in camouflage walking towards him, but in the opposite direction. According to Missouri law, a hunter who hunts with a firearm is required to wear such clothing. So the appearance of a person in such an outfit did not arouse any suspicion. When he reached Holman, the neighbor saw that he was whole and unharmed. According to Larry, the bullet had whistled literally centimeters from his head, but miraculously did not touch him. His friend suggested that the shooter was some novice hunter who was not very skilled with weapons. Holman himself admitted that he had not noticed anyone in the forest, so he was probably hit by accident. At that time, the incident did not seem particularly strange. Every year, you can meet hundreds of people in the hunting grounds, and from time to time there are unfortunate cases when one hunter mistakes another for game and unintentionally injures or even fatally wounds them. However, not that many people hunted in this area. Therefore, such an incident might have seemed somewhat strange, especially given that Larry was eventually shot after all. And now Detective Randy finally became convinced that this was definitely not an accident. Unfortunately, Holman's friend could not describe the oncoming hunter in detail, whom he had seen in the forest only in passing and had not paid attention to his appearance. Meanwhile, investigators continued to thoroughly examine the area around Larry's discovered car, hoping to find the place where the fire had come from. Most of the area was covered with dense thickets. However, the trajectory of the bullet indicated that the shooter was somewhat apart from the forest, near the railroad track. It was here that a woman named Helen lived, the same one who reported the suspicious car to the police. The detectives visited her to find out if she had noticed anything strange on the day of the murder. According to Helen, some time after her call to the police, a car parked not far from the house. A man in camouflage got out of it, took a large hunting rifle out of the trunk, and headed towards the forest. However, he never actually crossed into the thicket itself. The woman admitted that this situation seemed unusual to her. After all, hunters usually go straight into the depths of the forest, and not loiter near houses. However, Helen did not see what happened next, so the further development of events remained behind the scenes for her. At the same time, investigators were studying the victim's biography, trying to find at least some leads that would lead to the trail of the probable killer. But Larry Holman turned out to be crystal clear. A calm family man, with no criminal past, a hunter and fisherman, the father of 2 children, a decent husband and a reliable worker. However, shortly before his death, he decided to quit the company where he had worked for many years, and that's why he was wondering if he could become an assistant worker for his neighbor. Everyone who knew Larry described him as a very good person who was hard to imagine being involved in anything illegal. The town of Festus was a small, close-knit community where everyone was in plain sight of everyone else. And it was this circumstance that was most alarming. Whoever was behind Holman's murder, his motives remained a mystery. The town began to fear that the criminal might turn out to be a maniac, for whom Larry was only the first victim. The public began to put pressure on law enforcement, demanding that the perpetrators be found and punished as soon as possible. Terrible rumors spread through the town, which usually only hinder the investigation, distracting from the real picture of events. However, this time the amount of evidence that cast doubt on the reputation of Larry's widow was steadily growing. The locals believed that Tammy was too young for Larry. There were rumors that she remained a flighty and insatiable woman who, hiding from her husband, wore revealing clothes and often visited nightclubs and bars. Many people noticed that during Larry's night work shifts, unfamiliar cars appeared near Tammy's house. For a long time, no one attached any special importance to this. After all, on the outside, Tammy gave the impression of a decent wife who spent a lot of time with her children. So everyone assumed that it was just friends or relatives coming to visit. However, after rumors that these meetings might not have been friendly at all, but that Tammy was actually regularly cheating on her husband with lovers, the situation changed. Now the whole company of young men who visited the Holman's house in the absence of the owner turned into potential suspects. After all, if the widow really led a dissolute life behind Larry's back, each of these men could have had a motive for eliminating him. One of the neighbors shared valuable information with the detectives. According to her, a few days after Larry's death, her children were playing with Tammy's children. When the woman came to pick them up to go home, she saw an unfamiliar man in the Holman's house who behaved surprisingly confidently, as if he were the master here. The witness was surprised by such behavior of a stranger, especially given that Larry had died quite recently under extremely suspicious circumstances. To all the neighbors' questions, Tammy replied that he was just her old classmate who decided to support his friend in a difficult hour. This information interested the investigators, and they quickly identified the mysterious guest. He turned out to be Tim Smith, who was described as a peculiar young man with a difficult character. The police found out that he had moved in with Tammy the very next day after she became a widow. Tim immediately took Larry's place and began to use his things absolutely freely. The deceased's children clearly did not like this situation. They were dissatisfied that a stranger was now in charge of their home. But Tammy seemed indifferent to her own children's feelings. It seemed that she had lost her head from love for Tim. The detectives decided to check if Smith had a criminal past. After all, it was quite possible that he had a motive for committing this brutal crime. However, contrary to expectations, law enforcement officers did not find anything suspicious. The most serious violation of the law in Tim's biography was only a few fines for non-compliance with traffic rules. However, it was found out that Tammy and Tim had indeed studied together in high school. They even dated for a while, but after graduation their paths diverged. Despite this, the investigators were alarmed by Tim's rapid transformation from an old acquaintance into the actual cohabitant of the widow. To shed light on the situation, the cops invited Smith to the police station for a conversation. They hoped that he would be able to tell them something important for the investigation. During the interrogation, the suspect behaved surprisingly arrogantly. He denied his involvement in Larry's death, but admitted that he had indeed moved in with Tammy immediately after her husband's death. Prior to that, he allegedly just visited her often and stayed overnight several times. Moreover, at the time of the interrogation, Tim was already openly calling himself Tammy's partner. He also confirmed that he had been Tammy's lover for a long time. According to him, Holman had never been particularly faithful to her husband and constantly had affairs on the side. Recently, she had allegedly been going to file for divorce in order to marry Tim in the future. This information led the detectives to think that it was the desire to get rid of Larry and tie her life to Smith that could have been Tammy's motive for murder. After all, why resort to a bloody massacre if she could have just gotten a peaceful divorce and built a new relationship? Anyway, now the couple in love had turned into the main suspects in this complicated case. Later, witnesses were found who confirmed that after the sudden widowhood, Tammy behaved more than strangely. Even at her own husband's funeral, she appeared in excessively revealing clothes for such a sad event. It seemed that the woman was not at all concerned about the mourning of those present. Tammy smiled all the time and openly flirted with other men. From time to time, she left the procession and suspiciously talked to someone on the phone for a long time. One of the sisters of the deceased Larry accidentally overheard how during these conversations Holman called male names. So rumors began to spread that, in addition to Tim Smith, Tammy had at least one more lover. One of the witnesses mentioned the name of Tom Rumbell in this context. The woman said that she had repeatedly seen him driving past the Holman's house while Larry was at work. At these moments, Tammy was usually sunbathing in front of the house in a rather revealing bikini. Tom allegedly stopped to greet her and pay a compliment. In passing, the neighbor hinted that a short-lived romance could have developed between them. However, as it turned out later, Rumbell was much younger than Tammy. So their love affair was fleeting and did not develop into anything serious. But this list of Holman's probable lovers did not end there. While talking to witnesses, the name of another man was mentioned again and again, Charlie Miller. Larry's older daughter from his first marriage said that she first heard about him when she was working as a cashier in a grocery store near the house. Once, her acquaintance came into the store and mentioned in passing that Tammy regularly meets with a neighbor named Charlie Miller. Allegedly, every day, after taking the children to school, she immediately goes to the park, where she spends long hours with him. There were also other young people who confirmed that they had repeatedly heard from Charlie himself about his relationship with Tammy Holman and his status as her lover. As it was possible to find out, Miller met Tammy during the period when he was hired by Larry to do repair work in their house. Charlie was married at the time, but despite this, he became so close to the owner that he began to be considered his friend. It would seem that Charlie's acquaintance with Tammy did not portend anything unusual. Miller was a married man and was doing repair work in the Holman's house for hire. Larry became so close to him that he began to consider him his friend. However, when Charlie first saw the owner's wife, he immediately noticed her playful behavior and propensity for flirting. These flirtations quickly grew into something more, and now the lovers were sharing a bed as soon as Larry went hunting. Soon after, Tammy confessed her infidelity to her husband. Larry himself had already suspected his wife of infidelity for some time, because he saw how Charlie looked at her with interest. Despite this, the Holmans did not get divorced, but decided to try to save the marriage. Larry openly asked Miller to leave his wife alone, to stop all courtship and gifts. But it is unknown whether he listened to his friend's request. Meanwhile, the circle of suspects in the murder was steadily expanding. Investigators found themselves in a difficult situation, because an excessive number of probable killers only complicated the investigation. In order to shed light on the personal life of the deceased, detectives requested data from his widow's cell phone. Even if Tammy did not shoot her husband with her own hands, she could well have been the customer of this brutal crime. After all, it was Holman who brought all these outside men into the family, each of whom had a real motive for reprisal against Larry. The police managed to find correspondence with 3 lovers at once in Tammy's phone: Tom Rumbell, Tim Smith and Charlie Miller. To sort out this love polygon, the cops decided to talk to the widow herself. In a conversation with law enforcement, the woman admitted that shortly before Larry's death, Tom Rumbell allegedly began to stalk her. To confirm her words, Tammy even provided printouts of messages he had sent her via messenger. According to Holman, she perceived Rumbell as an extremely dangerous person who only caused her fear and anxiety. The man allegedly wrote that they could be happy together, talked about his feelings and desire to get married and have children. Tammy claimed that she tried in every possible way to keep Tom at a distance, was frightened by his persistence and confused by the frankness of his confessions. She even suggested that Rumbell could have been involved in Larry's murder. As a sign of cooperation with the investigation, Holman voluntarily handed over all the printouts of her correspondence with Tom to the police. According to the widow, the harassment by Rumbell did not stop even after the death of her husband and the resumption of relations with Tim Smith. The woman said that she simply did not know how to get rid of the intrusive suitor. Shortly after the interrogation, Tammy even had to go to court for a restraining order against Tom. Interestingly, during a meeting with the police, Rumbell himself readily admitted that he had feelings for Holman. At the same time, he called her appeal to the court a clear exaggeration. The man assured that he did not threaten Tammy at all, and that day he just wanted to give her a bouquet of flowers, not frighten her. However, Tom's behavior still seemed suspicious to the cops. In particular, they managed to find out that Rumbell had repeatedly been inside the Holman's house, because he knew all the details of its layout. This circumstance indirectly refuted the widow's words about unwanted harassment by Tom. It seems that in reality he visited Tammy during the periods when Larry was not at home. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed the autopsy of the body and reported that Holman was shot with a large-caliber firearm. According to their conclusion, a .243 caliber hunting rifle designed for deer hunting was used. The bullet also fit this caliber. It was quite heavy and powerful. Continuing to collect and analyze information, investigators repeatedly came across the name of Charlie Miller. It was even possible to establish that shortly before the murder, during the period of renovation of the Holman's house, Charlie and Larry discussed the topic of hunting. At the same time, Miller showed his friend his .243 caliber rifle. Looking at this weapon, Larry could not even imagine that he would soon be shot with it. Wanting to stir up the public, the police made public all the available information in the case, including information about the caliber of the weapon used to kill Holman. After that, the name of Charlie Miller surfaced again. Someone from the locals called the police station and said that Tammy's lover owned a hunting gun of exactly .243 caliber. The cops immediately seized Miller's weapon and sent it for ballistic examination. Fortunately, the investigators already had physical evidence for comparison. After all, near the car of the murdered man, a deformed bullet was found, which was the cause of Larry's death. After the mentioned projectile pierced the victim's head and smashed the windshield, it flew back several dozen meters before falling to the ground. With each new testimony, an unattractive picture of the personal life of the Holman couple became clearer. Instead of a banal love triangle, the outlines of a whole network of Tammy's relationships with other men behind her legal husband's back began to show through. And for each of them, Larry's death could have been a desirable denouement. Investigators knew that Charlie Miller had long maintained a friendly relationship with Holman. At least until he started sleeping with his wife. As soon as the secret became apparent, it inevitably had to provoke a conflict between the former friends. Perhaps it was this dispute that eventually resulted in bloodshed. And the police also managed to find out that after Larry's death, Charlie did not stop communicating closely with Tammy. However, unlike Tim Smith, who immediately took the place of the owner in the Holman house, Miller chose a different approach. He simply gave the widow money and bought various things for her, hoping to receive the desired reward sooner or later. But let's get back to the investigation. Through the intricacies of numerous adulteries, detectives were gradually making their way to the truth. And the first on their list of priorities was Charlie Miller. It turned out that he was driving a car that matched the description of the car noticed near the railroad track not far from the murder scene. The witness got a good look at the driver, but did not communicate with him personally. When this woman was shown a photo of Miller, she identified him without a shadow of a doubt. Almost simultaneously, the results of the ballistic examination arrived, which finally confirmed that Larry had been shot with Charlie's rifle. With all this evidence, on January 9, 2001, law enforcement officers arrived at Miller's house with an arrest warrant. After politely reading him his rights, the police asked to take the suspect to the station to talk about his possible involvement in the murder of his friend. After listening to the standard formalities such as the right to remain silent, Charlie stared at the officer's face. And then unexpectedly, simply and calmly, he admitted his guilt, saying, "I killed him." After Charlie Miller's confession to the murder of Larry Holman, he was arrested and taken to the police station. As for Tim Smith and Tom Rumbell, these two were finally excluded from the list of suspects, they were not involved in the reprisal against Holman. Soon Miller agreed to personally show the cops exactly how he killed his former friend. The man actually came to the house near the railway track, where he was seen by one of the witnesses. It was from there that Charlie took his rifle and went into the field. That day, Miller was dressed in camouflage. He moved along the track, repeating in detail the same route that he had already taken in the morning on the day of the murder. According to him, he had to cross rough terrain for almost a kilometer. But the investigators were most disturbed by the main thing: how could Charlie have known where and at what time Larry would be? Miller answered this question without hesitation. It turns out that it was Tammy herself who instigated him to kill her husband, complaining about the brutal treatment by her tyrant husband. And Charlie, in his imagination, saw himself in the role of a night rescuer. And Miller also said that the attempt on Holman's life on the day of the murder was not the first. Remember the story of Larry's matchmaker about the bullet that whistled a centimeter from Holman's head during a forest hunt? So, it was none other than Charlie who shot him then. It was not a tragic accident. Tammy precisely indicated to her lover where exactly her husband would be walking in the forest. So it was not difficult for Miller to track down the prey. However, after the first failed attempt, Tammy stopped communicating with Charlie for a while. He had to persistently persuade the woman to continue the relationship. In the end, she agreed and again began to incite her lover to murder. Holman was sure that this time the criminal plan would not misfire. Tammy pressured Miller, using a future marriage as an argument. And although Charlie considered Larry his friend, he still decided to commit this terrible crime. All this led to a logical question: why didn't Tammy just file for divorce if the marriage was bringing her only suffering? The answer, as always, was painfully simple: the woman did not want to share property and custody of the children with Larry. More than anything, she wanted to get a large insurance payment in the event of her husband's death. Shortly before his death, he had taken out $1 million policy. Tammy was unlikely to want to let such an amount slip through her fingers. Only the policy turned out to be not an insurance policy, but one that protects against losses caused by an employee. So in the end, the widow managed to get not $1 million, but only $150,000. The police, of course, did not bypass Tammy with an interrogation. She continued to deny her involvement in the murder. According to Holman, she had nothing to do with her husband's death at all. The woman tried to completely shift the responsibility onto Charlie. She allegedly developed an excessive attachment to her through a short-lived affair. Allegedly, Miller constantly demanded more than just an affair. Charlie allegedly began to perceive Larry as the only obstacle on the way to their mutual happiness, so he decided to get rid of his rival. According to Tammy's version, she knew about Miller's gloomy thoughts, but until the last moment she did not believe that he would really dare to commit murder. At the end of the interrogation, Holman let slip that sometimes she feels guilty for her husband's death and all these extramarital affairs. The prosecutor only needed this: he immediately latched onto the last phrase, regarding it as a confession. For his part, Charlie claimed that Tammy personally discussed the plan of action with him. Allegedly, after Larry's death, she was supposed to receive a considerable inheritance, marry Miller and enjoy a prosperous life. But when Holman met another man, Charlie was extremely disappointed in his beloved. Moreover, according to Tammy, the offended Miller began to pursue and intimidate her. The woman admitted that she never intended to marry Charlie, and all his hopes for a joint future were in vain. However, it seemed unlikely to the cops that Miller would suddenly go for the cold-blooded murder of a friend. Surely he had a good motive. First, there was a trial for Charlie. Given the irrefutable evidence and the defendant's personal confession, this process became more of a formality. 40-year-old Miller publicly admitted his guilt in premeditated murder. The only thing he referred to as a mitigating circumstance was a temporary emotional disorder in taking medications that allegedly clouded his ability to make rational decisions. In the end, Charlie made a deal with the investigation and received 25 years in prison. He will not be able to be released until 2026. But the trial of Tammy was much more complicated and confusing. The woman continued to deny any involvement in the crime. And in the courtroom, her lawyer insisted on this same version. But he could not confirm the words of his client with anything. On the other hand, the prosecutors had a lot of trumps, in particular, numerous telephone conversations and correspondence between Tammy and Charlie. They eloquently testified that Miller did not belong to the category of dangerous stalkers, as Holman tried to portray him. Of course, this lie did not benefit Tammy. The jury had less and less doubt that a cunning and hypocritical person who at the same time turned the heads of several men at once had ended up in the dock. Evidence not in Tammy's favor was also indirect evidence. For example, the prosecution placed special emphasis on the numerous phone calls between Holman and Miller on the day of the murder. Obviously, the lovers were discussing the details of the contract crime. And in court, Charlie testified directly implicating Tammy as the instigator of the reprisal against her husband. Despite this, the chances of the prosecution for an unequivocal victory were still in doubt. In order not to take risks, the prosecution resorted to a trick and offered Holman to conclude a plea agreement known as the Alford Doctrine. Its essence is that, without confessing to the crime as such, the defendant at the same time admits, there is quite enough evidence against him for the jury to lean towards a guilty verdict. As a result, 35-year-old Tammy received 7 years in prison. True, the woman never admitted her guilt, insisting that she only went for the deal out of necessity. In 2009, after serving her sentence, Holman returned home to Festus. She hoped that she would be able to restore relations with her children and start life from scratch. But it was not to be. Growing up, Larry Holman's son and daughter still puzzle over the same question. Why, if the marriage became unbearable, did the mother not just divorce the father? Instead, through her actions, she doomed the children to an orphan's life, without a father and without a mother. Our world is full of mysteries and secrets, and danger sometimes lurks in the most unexpected places. Today's story will demonstrate how even everyday events can turn into a real horror for some of us. Usually, criminals are afraid of the law and the police, because no one wants to waste years of their life behind bars. However, some individuals involved in criminal cases are so restless that they can only be stopped by the most severe methods. Paul was born on August 10, 1980, in the Australian state of Queensland. Besides him, the family had an older sister and several step-siblings on his father's side. When the boy was 4, his parents decided to divorce. They agreed that the children would remain under the mother's care. Despite certain difficulties during this period, Paul seemed like an ordinary child. But over time, his mother began to notice problems with his behavior. The woman turned to a doctor, who attributed the disorder to the parents' divorce. In the specialist's opinion, everything was supposed to normalize over time. However, several years passed, and the boy's behavior only worsened. When Paul turned 10, his mother was practically in despair due to her son's absolute uncontrollability. He was diagnosed with a number of deviations, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So the boy underwent appropriate treatment, which seemed to help. Despite all the difficulties, Paul studied well. In 1998, he graduated from high school and entered the Queensland University of Technology. Here, the young man dreamed of obtaining a degree in business and finance. Thanks to his remarkable intelligence, he managed to do this without much effort. After graduation, Paul got a job in the finance department of a motorcycle dealership in northern Queensland. The work involved close interaction with people in a large team. Colleagues considered the guy attractive, eloquent, intelligent, and sociable, always ready to help. For one of his co-workers, he even organized a fundraiser for her daughter's treatment. No one even suspected how deceptive this impression was. However, it was practically impossible to discern Paul's true nature. This attractive young man seemed impeccable and knew how to keep himself in check. On the contrary, he created the image of a kind and compassionate person, regularly donating money to various charitable foundations, supporting friends and loved ones. Thanks to this, the guy earned a reputation as a good person. Only the closest circle knew who the main character of this story really was. Paul turned out to be a masterful manipulator who clearly suffered from mental disorders but avoided doctors and any help. The guy was a pathological liar with remarkable eloquence, which helped him get his way at any cost. His favorite method was threatening to take his own life. In the period from March 2003 to October 2010, Paul had several girlfriends, all beauties, one after another. It was in relationships with the opposite that the most frightening trait of the hero of this story manifested itself. He behaved so aggressively that by 2016, 5 restraining orders had been issued against him at the requests of various women. But even this did not stop Paul. He violated several of these orders at once, for which he was held accountable. All of Paul's ex-girlfriends unanimously called him a self-confident manipulator who tried to tightly control their every step. At the same time, the guy constantly humiliated his girlfriends and even allowed himself to use physical force. It was worth only hinting at a possible breakup, and the situation became truly life-threatening for the girls. At first, Paul appealed to pity, talking about an allegedly terminally ill relative or his own diagnosis. Of course, all this was an outright lie. When manipulation did not work, he resorted to threats of such behavior indicated that Paul was a typical abuser who strived by all means to control his victim. At the same time, the young man had one particularly unpleasant trait. He did not hesitate to threaten and stalk not only the girlfriends who dared to leave him but also their families. When Paul felt that he was losing control of the situation, he resorted to constant phone calls to his girl's relatives, intimidation, and stalking. The young man made every effort to buy time, prevent a breakup, and keep the next victim with him for as long as possible. To do this, he even invented fake identities to deceive his girlfriends and cover his tracks when the deception was exposed. And every time when an unpleasant conversation began with Paul, trying to stop or punish him, the guy invariably referred to his mental disorder. He seemed to sincerely believe that deviations could justify cruelty and inadequate behavior. However, both the girls themselves and their relatives insisted that Paul should go to a psychiatric clinic. Unfortunately, he did not do this voluntarily, and law enforcement agencies remained inactive. The story's hero never told his chosen ones about these problems at the beginning of the relationship, obviously fearing to frighten the next girl, captivated by his attractive appearance. According to Paul, he suffered from a dissociative personality disorder. The man called his I good and evil, sometimes going into details about his condition. He admitted that up to 9 different personalities coexisted within him. Despite this, Paul was indeed a charismatic and remarkably persuasive person, so he had no problem captivating women. The young man had an attractive appearance, but all idealized images were shattered already after a short relationship. Usually, he was enough for no more than a month. In 2014, he tried to start a family and proposed to one of his ex-girlfriends named Samantha. They met back in 2008 but broke up for the same reason why Paul's relationships never worked out. He was too aggressive and cruel, stalked her. Despite this, over the course of 6 years, the former lovers continued to keep in touch. Samantha, like others, insisted that her chosen one needed the help of specialists. The story's hero managed to convince the girl that he would make a good husband and that he would definitely consult doctors. Samantha agreed, and on February 2, 2014, they officially got married. Of course, all of Paul's promises turned out to be lies. At first, it seemed that everything was fine with the couple, but after a few weeks, the young man's condition began to get out of control. After 7 months of living together, the situation deteriorated so much that the marriage became unbearable. Paul lost all control over himself, and Samantha was ready to end the relationship once and for all. Unexpectedly, she made one last attempt to save this union. In September 2014, the wife suggested that her husband go on a joint vacation to Orlando, Florida, USA. The couple was going to renew their wedding vows before returning to Australia. No matter how romantic it looked and could have worked, upon returning home, Paul continued to behave as usual. The situation, of course, only escalated. Eventually, the man flew to Orlando again, which he liked so much. Here he created a profile on Tinder, where he described himself exclusively in the best light. Of course, Paul did not say a word about his mental deviations. Many girls began to write to the man's page, but he was looking for something special. And so, among others, Paul came across the contacts of the local TV presenter Brittany Ankel. The 32-year-old beauty was quite famous on television and had a brilliant future ahead of her. The journalist used a dating site account in search of a relationship, and Paul immediately caught her fancy. They began to correspond in the app, then exchanged contacts on social networks and email addresses. The couple even had several video chat sessions via Skype. The story's hero was so enchanted by the TV presenter that he decided to end the relationship with his wife on his own. He urgently flew to Australia and started the divorce process. In March 2015, the man wrote to Brittany that he was going to return to Florida to be with her. At that point, they had already gotten to know each other quite well, but during the entire period of communication, the journalist did not even suspect that she was dealing with a dangerous person. Paul was very good at hiding his flaws, so the next victim fell into his trap. However, Brittany found out about his divorce and informed her interlocutor that she did not want to become the reason for the breakup of a family. The TV presenter insisted that Paul stay in Australia, to which he lied that he had already divorced his wife and nothing was holding him back. In this case, he managed to convince Brittany to give him a chance. The girl agreed to be with him for 3 months in order to understand each other and get to know each other better. Finally, they met, and despite the fact that Paul was still officially married, the man continued to deceive. At first, the story's hero behaved like a victim, a caring and loving man, but, as in other relationships, he quickly showed his true colors. More precisely, after about 3 weeks, Brittany noticed that he was behaving strangely and unpredictably. It seemed that he did not control his own emotions. She was a smart girl and quickly realized where everything was going. Therefore, the girl stated that it was over between them. Unfortunately, she did not know that this was the brightest signal for action for him. Paul began to flood the girl with messages with demands. The man insisted that she live with him for these 3 months, as they initially agreed when Brittany did not give him a chance. Yes, she would be able to finally decide whether it was worth continuing the relationship. Paul believed that the girl had no right to simply refuse her promises. The man emphasized that he flew to her across the ocean, and she behaved so unworthily with him, but all this was carefully thought out. The manipulator could not convince Brittany. Then Paul began to tell her that his father had just died, so he needed support. Brittany was the only close person in the USA. As a result, it worked. The girl believed this story, thinking that no one would make up such a thing. Her father had died of a brain tumor a few years before these events. Therefore, she understood how hard it was for him. Paul knew about this and used cunning intentionally to lure the girl into a trap. For some time, she supported him and tried to establish a relationship. Of course, this did not affect his behavior in any way. He became more and more inadequate. Therefore, after some time, the TV presenter again decided to break the connection. Then the story's hero began to threaten voluntary death. Unfortunately, the trick worked again and the relationship continued, but most of all Brittany was worried about her boyfriend's behavior during her work. For several hours while she was away from home, he sent her dozens of messages and letters. He could call even when the girl was on the air. Naturally, for a journalist, this was a big problem. It could even cost her the job she had put her whole life into. Brittany could not stand the pressure and again tried to break up with the guy. When he began to invent new fables that became more and more bizarre. Paul began to say that all this time she was not dating him, but his twin brother. It was he who behaved unacceptably. This time Brittany no longer believed these stories. Then Paul told how he was abused in childhood. That was what led to the emotional state he was in now. The man again tried to make Brittany feel sorry for him in every possible way. All this lying led to the story's hero confessing that he allegedly had a brain tumor and would die soon. Paul added that he was afraid to die alone. Unfortunately, he again turned out to be convincing enough for Brittany to believe. All this led to the continuation of the relationship, but the girl lived in constant fear. The TV presenter cried every day, panic attacks began during the day. Brittany was so tense that she constantly felt bad. She planned to get out of this relationship again, but Paul prepared to keep the girl. He threatened to publish her revealing photos. Now her career, which she had been building all her conscious life, was at stake. Paul even began to write compromising messages on the girl's work profile. He called her a murderer, hinting that he would take his own life in case of a breakup. As a result, Brittany was forced to delete several of her social media profiles. Nevertheless, she was bound by her career obligations. As a public figure, she needed to maintain social networks to promote herself. Of course, the guy understood this perfectly well and willingly used it for control. All this could not last forever, but finally Brittany left him and turned to the police, like all the previous girls. During this period, he actively flooded her with compromising messages, stalked her wherever he could. The girl complained to law enforcement officers, who energetically took up the case. They provided assistance and support, given that the reporter's activities were associated with certain risks. On May 1st, she sent a message to the inadequate Australian, warning him not to stalk her anymore and not try to contact her through any means of communication. The girl frankly admitted that she no longer wanted to have any contact with Paul. She simply ignored all subsequent messages from the manipulator. Then Paul sent 2 more letters demanding payment for him to stop stalking. Otherwise, he threatened to take his own life. In fact, Paul earned quite well to demand money. He was very economical, drove an old car, rented a small modest apartment. Thanks to this, he managed to accumulate $150,000. Over the next few days, the stalker did not calm down. It seemed that he was only trying even harder to cling to his victim. During this period, he began to talk about his 9 personalities. Brittany was in shock, frightened, because she had never dealt with people suffering from dissociative disorder before. Thanks to active work through social networks and television, Paul could easily get information about the journalist. He followed her through news broadcasts and publications. The stalker began to appear near Brittany's house, at work, without an invitation. He managed to terrorize the girl so much that it became increasingly difficult for her to go on the air. At these moments, she could not feel calm in front of the camera, because she began to feel uncontrollable fear. Thanks to the lawyer hired by Brittany, Paul was once arrested and accused of stalking and extortion. As a result, he confessed to stalking, but again referred to insanity. During this period, the TV presenter found out that all his stories about twin brothers and a tumor were lies. His father was also alive and well. She was shocked that there were no limits to his lies. Soon Paul was deported to Australia and banned from entering the United States. After being forcibly returned to his homeland, the story's hero changed his last name to Lambert, his own mother's maiden name. Apparently, in this way, he wanted to clear his name, which was now tarnished by problems with the law. When his wife Samantha found out about the deportation, she also decided to turn to the police for fear that he would try to return to her again. Officially, they were still married. The young woman was issued a restraining order. However, these methods never stopped the man. He began to flood her with calls and messages, but she did not respond. On February 22, 2016, Paul persuaded his wife to go together to a divorce lawyer to sign a petition for divorce. She agreed, and this was a big mistake. During this trip, he began to insult her, threatened to crash the car so that they would die together. And when Samantha demanded to let her out, he sharply accelerated, frightening her half to death. After stopping, Paul hit her in the face. Fortunately, the young woman managed to run out of the car and report to the police. After that, Paul was arrested and accused of abduction and bodily harm. They finally divorced. On June 19 of the same year, he appeared before the Queensland court and was sentenced to 9 months in prison. However, he was soon released on parole. After that, Paul was given 12 months probation, and his driver's license was also suspended for 2 years. A few months later, he again violated the conditions of parole when he moved to another state of Australia, got a new job, but did not report this to the inspector. However, at first, law enforcement officers had no idea about this. Each time, in order to check in, the convict made a flight from state to state, behaving as if he was living his former life. A big problem was also that he did not visit a psychiatrist, never went to the hospital to deal with his problems. The situation changed after the attack on his wife, when he was obliged to visit a psychologist. So it was found out that he suffered from much more serious illnesses than ordinary depression. Dozens of sessions and trips to a psychologist were held from August 2015 to May 2016. During this period, his behavioral peculiarities became known not only to psychologists but also to psychiatrists. Paul was prescribed several prescriptions, but he refused to take them, and later stopped visiting a specialist altogether. In fact, almost immediately after the divorce from Samantha, the story's hero met a new girl in his favorite app. The next victim turned out to be 28-year-old Angela J., who had recently completed her residency at a medical school. She worked as a doctor in a Sydney hospital and lived hundreds of kilometers away from the story's hero in another state of Australia. During this period, she also used the app, as she dreamed of finding a life partner after a painful divorce from her husband. Having met Paul, Angela immediately felt sympathy for him, not even suspecting how dangerous this guy was. Soon they had their first date, and then several more. At these meetings, Paul behaved restrainedly in order to lure the next victim into a trap. The new girl realized that they had a lot in common. Soon Angela brought this person home to introduce him to her family. The girl seemed genuinely happy, but her stepfather, after 5 minutes of communicating with Paul, realized that something was wrong with him. He prophetically told his wife that this person would bring trouble to their home, but, unfortunately, everyone ignored him. The couple had an agreement. The girl put career first, asked not to bother her on weekdays when she worked at the hospital. And they met on weekends. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly, but then she began to notice alarming moments. Angela felt that someone was watching her, entering the house without permission when she was at work. Paul began to behave more and more defiantly, so Angela decided to end this connection. When she reported the unpleasant news, the story's hero began to cry, using his favorite scheme with threats to harm himself. For a medic, all this seemed painful. When the young woman decided to fix the relationship with him, Paul admitted that he had a personality disorder. Now he went even further, invented a friend named Dan, bought a mobile phone for him, from which he continued to manipulate the new victim. This same Dan confirmed several times that Paul was trying to take his own life because of the girl's desire to break up. He managed to deceive her, make her feel guilty. Eventually, Angela agreed to be with him for a while. He pressured her professional qualities. As a doctor, she just wanted to help. A month after the start of the relationship, she made it clear to her boyfriend that there would be no more romantic relationship between them, she was only interested in his recovery. It seemed that Paul was completely fine with that too. All this happened in parallel with visiting doctors, but Paul did not come to the last appointment. It turned out that at that moment Angela invited him to join the alumni meeting. When they met, the girl again emphasized that there was no relationship between them, they communicated only as friends. But all this turned into a disaster. To help Angela out, her sister arrived, who managed to pick up the girl in time. Paul behaved inadequately all evening, even stole her purse with all her things. And the property was returned only after several hours of persuasion, through the efforts of several friends of the manipulator's victim. In the morning, everyone turned to the police, as dozens of threatening messages were received overnight. At first, the police did not react, despite the fact that numerous similar crimes by Paul were known. The guy violated 5 restraining orders, the conditions of parole, and also committed many other offenses. It seemed that luck was on the side of the madman, or changes in the police complicated the search for information. The next day, Paul rented a white hatchback, and then went to a hardware store, where he bought a universal knife, an axe, and 2 rolls of tape. After that, he was stopped on the road for speeding, but it was more of a document check. Of course, driving was a violation, because the license was still suspended. Nevertheless, Paul managed to convince the officer that he had no idea about the restrictions. Strangely, the man managed to persuade the law enforcement officer to let him go. He met his beloved in the evening on the doorstep of the house, immediately after she returned from her sister. Angela managed to run into the house, after which she received frightening messages from her ex. Paul admitted that he stole one of her house keys and could go inside. Therefore, Angela ran to the neighbors, fearing that the criminal would come for her. They helped her and called the police. Help arrived at her house around 9 p.m., the girl was taken to the police station. After she told about all these events related to Paul, it was decided to open a criminal case. On the recommendation of the police, Angela was going to go to her relatives. She previously determined which key was stolen and asked the landlord to change the locks. The girl also placed knives around the house in such a way that in case of a sudden attack, she could quickly arm herself. During this period, the ex was very close, hiding from the police in her city. He even made attempts to purchase firearms. The story's hero visited a gun store, but due to a suspended license, he could not get it. He was also denied the purchase of a stun gun, even his heart-wrenching stories did not work. However, later he returned and asked for a hunting knife, which was still sold to him. On the same day, he rented a room in a hotel located opposite the hospital where Angela worked. On November 1st, Paul returned the car and took a larger minivan, explaining that he would need to transport a lot of luggage. After that, he sent a message to the whole family, declaring his intention to commit suicide. But relatives who had been trying to help him for many years were simply tired of this endless lying and stopped responding to such statements, because they sounded regularly. On November 2nd, the stalker again visited a hardware store, where this time he bought a crowbar, a hammer, and a lot of ties. On November 3rd, 2016, Angela was at work. On the same day, neighbors noticed a stranger in her house, who, as it turned out later, was Paul, but no one warned her about it. When in the evening she arrived home to rest and went to her bedroom, he suddenly attacked her with a knife, jumping out of the wardrobe. The stalker clamped her mouth with his hand, the girl could not resist, but Angela managed to buy some time by asking to go to the toilet. She was terrified but decided to try to escape. Unfortunately, Paul quickly caught up with her and began to stab her. The first ones fell on the legs, and then she received 11 wounds in the chest and arms. By some miracle, Angela managed to get up, then Paul took the spare gasoline, doused her all over and even poured liquid into her mouth, but the victim was not going to give up and screamed. Luckily for Angela, at that time a neighbor was walking his dog. The man realized what was happening, grabbed a crowbar from his work car, and rushed towards the house to help the girl. Angela managed to slip out of the stalker's hands thanks to the fact that the gasoline turned out to be slippery. Paul himself slipped on a puddle and fell. This gave precious seconds, and the neighbor helped to hide in his house. There his wife called for help and treated the bleeding wounds according to the victim's instructions. Finally, she was taken to the hospital, and the police who arrived began to search for the attacker. By this time, he had long disappeared. Strangely, around 7:05, when the victim of the attack was being taken to the hospital, he called her, but in response he heard only the angry screams of the neighbor who saved the girl and accompanied her to the medical facility. Paul hung up and called Angela's mother. The stalker reported that he was going to commit suicide and asked to convey an apology to the girl. She did not believe it and hung up. After that, he called the police, spoke in the third person, accusing his personalities of harming all the women he knew. He claimed that he did not control himself and they would all be in danger while he was alive. They tried to persuade him to surrender to the authorities, but instead Paul just hung up. Thanks to this call, it was possible to track the location of the criminal. He was moving along the east coast of Australia. At 9:15 a.m., a chase began after him, but Paul was driving so fast and driving so inadequately that this venture had to be abandoned. Special spikes were installed on the road, thanks to which the vehicle was stopped. The inadequate man ran out of the rented car with a knife and ran down the road until he encountered 3 officers. They kept their weapons at the ready, but apparently the stalker was not going to surrender. They blinded him with a powerful flashlight, but this only provoked aggression. At the same time, law enforcement officers tried to talk to him and convince him to surrender. But the manipulator clearly wanted to die. Paul even shouted, asking what he needed to do for the officers to open fire. They tried to calm him down, convince him. Then one of the policemen approached from behind and fired a stun gun. The contacts did not reach the target due to the thick clothing worn by the criminal. This drove Paul into a rage. He threateningly approached the police, waving a knife. Until several shots rang out from all sides. At 7:37 p.m., 37-year-old Paul was shot dead, which was stated by the paramedics who arrived at the scene. His mother was informed of what happened, but she could not cry or be upset by this news. Angela was in the hospital at that time. She was saved. And the life of the 28-year-old girl was fortunately not in danger. She suffered 11 stab wounds. The young woman also felt relief when she heard that the criminal would no longer be able to harm anyone. All women who became victims of the stalker suffered from depressive and post-traumatic disorders to one degree or another. However, everyone managed to rehabilitate and recover. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.